Meeting of Auckland Council's Planning Committee. Welcome to the Mayor, the councillors, the Independent Māori Statutory Board members, our staff on this call, and members of the public who might be listening as well. And I also would like to pay special mention in my introduction to this meeting to member Karen Wilson. This is Karen's first meeting as the new representative of the Independent Māori Statutory Board on the Planning Committee here at Auckland Council. So welcome, Karen. Members, I will pass to Kalinda Iswar for the roll call. Kalinda will take the call of members now. Passing to you, please, Kalinda.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Bartley. Councillor Casey.
Morena, Kalinda.
Morena. Councillor Cashmore.
Present.
Councillor Collins.
Kia ora, Kalinda. Kia ora, Chair, and everybody.
Councillor Coon.
Kia ora, Kekoneo.
Councillor Cooper.
Kia ora, Cooper. Sorry, Kio's Kojo.
Councillor Dalton.
Good morning, everyone.
Councillor Filipaina.
Morena, and Tina Kote, my apologies for not putting the camera on.
Councillor Fletcher.
Kia ora.
Councillor Mia Gafilgoff.
Kia ora, and if we can do something about the feedback, Kalinda, that would be great.
Yes, I'll try. Thank you, Mia. Member Henare.
Kia ora.
Councillor Henderson.
Ata Maria.
Councillor Hills. Councillor Mulholland.
Good morning, everyone. Present.
Councillor Newman.
Good morning, Kalinda.
Councillor Sayers.
Yeah, thank you, Kalinda.
Councillor Simpson.
Morena, good morning, everyone.
Councillor Stewart.
Good morning.
Councillor Walker.
Good morning.
Councillor Watson.
Hi, Kalinda.
Member Wilson. And Councillor Young. Okay, thank you. That's a roll call done.
Good morning.
The Chair would just like me to remind members that to mute your microphones when you're not speaking, and that the chat bar, the messages in the chat bar are to indicate questions and comments only, please, because everything in there is able to be requested under Lagoima. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
I'm here too, Kalinda. Richard, I just got cut off during the feedback. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kalinda. Thanks, members. Thanks for that
Chair,
summary.
Just Tau Henare here. I think
Welcome,
Karen
Tau.
late.
Yes, I'm just coming to the apologies, Member Henare, and thank you. We do have a note of that. Just before we go to the apologies, members, Kalinda has just given us a brief reminder of the protocols of how to communicate as we undertake this meeting remotely. I have to express my apology for not being able to use the video because of some big bandwidth demand as I am sharing my home office with somebody else. But I encourage you to, wherever possible, please use the video that's available to you. So I will take the apology received for lateness, as Member Henare has just reminded me, from Independent Member Karen Wilson. I don't have any other apologies. I will move accordingly, and Councillor Bartley will second. All those in favour say aye.
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 To the contrary, please say no. And I declare that carried. I will now go to item 2. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest on any matter before us at this meeting today, members? There being none, I will move to item 3, and I will move to confirm the minutes of 5 August 2021, the open minutes, and Councillor Bartley will second. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 To the contrary, please say no. I declare that carried. Which takes us to item 4. I've not received any petitions, therefore we'll go to item 5, public input. There have been no public input requests for this meeting. To item 6, local board input. There were no requests of me for local board input for this meeting, which takes me now to item 7, extraordinary items. Members, I'd like to take this time to hear a brief COVID and West Auckland flooding update from our Mayor. So I'll just move very quickly that the committee hear a briefing from Mayor Goff on COVID and West Auckland flooding. So I'll just put that up there, Kalinda. I'll just do that quite quickly, that the committee hear a briefing from Mayor Goff on COVID response and West Auckland flooding. Seconded by Councillor Bartley. I'll just make sure everybody can see it, so you know what you're voting on. I think pretty straightforward. All those in favour say aye.
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 To the contrary, no. Declare that carried. Mayor Goff, I will now hand to you for a brief update.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and I will keep it brief. Yeah, let's start off with the difficult aspects of COVID. Our MIQ facilities are currently under huge pressure. I mean, not only have we got the 671 cases, some of which will be coming out of that category now, but we've got 300 people who have arrived from Afghanistan, and we've got red flights from Australia. So I think we can expect to see some announcements in the near future from government about expanding that capacity, because without an expansion, we'll be in some difficulty. The other point of difficulty, I guess, yesterday was what they called a bounce around, which was probably a nice way of saying the numbers went back up again to 75. That's a concern. So I guess if we're finished by 1 o'clock today, we'll all be anxiously watching what's happening there. The good news around vaccinations, after harping on for probably 6 months about the need to prioritise Auckland and getting a fairly stony response, we've now got a positive response from government indicating that Auckland is an area of greater risk. We're more vulnerable here for all the reasons that everybody knows, and that either there'll be a reallocation of vaccinations so that we can keep the momentum up in Auckland. There'll be new sources of vaccination, or vaccine, I should say, sourced from overseas, and that will enable us to keep going. At the moment, we're roughly a third or just under a third of all the vaccinations, which is proportionate to our population size. But I'd really like to keep that momentum up, where we're doing, maybe 25,000 vaccinations a day in Auckland. That's fantastic, and we can get through large sections of the population. Just one point, and I think I've asked my head of staff to also contact the local ward councillors on this. There is a big facility at the airport, at the Park and Ride Centre, for drive-through vaccinations. It's not being used to full capacity at the moment. So just get the message out. If people are keen to get a vaccination, that's where they can go to. Now, I hope that doesn't lead to an overwhelming number of people on the site there, but it seems a shame that we have a capacity that's not being fully used. We can do several thousand people a day at that site. Out south, and Councillor Newman had raised with me concerns about Maori and Pacifica vaccinations. The Papakura Marae has opened up as a drive-through, and on its first day did 287. So that, alongside the Manarewa Marae, hopefully will be a culturally comfortable place for people in particularly the Maori community, to get vaccinated, and we need to keep the pressure up on Pacifica vaccinations as well. On testing, the testing stations seem to be under a little less pressure now. We've got the 26 community testing stations, but more people also using GPs and pharmacies, and those numbers are expanding. The boundary restrictions with the Waikato coming into place, we've commandeered part of the North Waikato. Maybe they can leave that in Auckland. It's a more natural fit. But the checkpoints seem to be going quite well. The report I had was only 8 people were turned back yesterday, and it's flowing reasonably, so that's good news. But there are much tighter restraints than last time, and that's for, I think, very good reasons. In terms of welfare, obviously, as we've discussed previously, there's some pressure there, but we're keeping a watching brief on that. So if you're aware of particular problems, please let Phil Wilson or Claire Rourke or myself know, and we can follow that through. And currently we're about to step up to 36 of our staff members making outbound calls, starting with those who are in isolation because of close contacts, and then moving on to elderly isolated people. West Auckland floods, the power is largely back on, which is good news. Many of the roads have reopened, but there are some roads that have been really badly damaged. For our West Auckland councillors, you'll be aware that Bethel's is currently cut off, though I think you can drive along the beach, and it will be a while before we can reconnect that. It's both big landslips and the undermining of the road, and Auckland Transport and Waka Kotahi are currently looking at using private land to be able to drive on as well. The water has receded. When I went up to Huapai and Kumeu the other day, it was already on the way down, but it's largely receded, which means that we can get on with the job of assessment. I still don't have clear figures on assessments or insurance claims. I'm hoping to get that later today. For the cleanup, the Waitakere transfer station will be open solely for those people needing to get rid of rubbish as a result of flood damage, and you need to contact the contact centre first to book in that appointment, and that will be done free of charge. Accommodation, we're currently accommodating 4 families, 9 people in toll, all told. That number may come up as it did in the Auckland tornado area. Animal shelter has taken on 2 cats that needed assistance there. There's only been 1 request for food, and the contact centre is not being overwhelmed with calls from people. People are being resilient, self-help and friends and family helping out. But make no, there's no doubt that there's a huge job to be done by people in cleaning up their properties and their commercial premises where there is flooding. There was a bit of commentary somewhere that, was Auckland Council to blame for this? Did we keep our drains clear? I'm a bit astounded by that. When you get 200 mils of rain overnight, wouldn't matter if your drains were 10 metres wide, you would have got that flooding. And I've raised that with Andrew Chin, and he said, look, regardless, there would have been this flooding because this is a 1 in 50-year event. But by and large, people that I talked to when I was up there were reasonably positive about finding a way through, and the community was working pretty well together. So that's it in a thumbnail sketch of what's happening, Mr. Chair. I can take questions if you require, or not if you want to get on with the business.
I think, thank you, Mayor. Really appreciate you being at the helm on this one, and being in the office too, Mr. Mayor, for us all. So I think we'll take some quick questions, I think, before we go and look at the agenda as it is before us. Now, I think I've got a question. First one, I've got a comment from Councillor Sayers. Councillor Sayers, can you just put your question very succinctly, please?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Phil, for your update as well. There's huge efforts going on out in the Kimu area at the moment, but there is a question that does need to be asked, and the Mayor just touched on it, and Andrew Chin has apparently made a comment around it, but I think we need to get a report back to us, Chris, either through you as Chair or the Mayor directly or the Chief Executive. I'm just asking what was preventable out there. The main reason for that question is, unsubstantiated comments to me that the wastewater systems hadn't been maintained for many years. So I think we just need to get the facts on that. If it's appropriate to do that through you, Chair, or the Mayor, or the Chief Executive, I think it should come back to the councillors, so it's preventable and there's a learning in this.
Yeah, look, we'll certainly do that, but we won't do that as a priority. The priority will be getting, the first priority was the rescue, and great work done by fire, police, army, and Muriwai Surf Club and Mairangi Bay Surf Lifesavers Clubs. So they were fantastic. Obviously, at the end of that process, we'll look at what might have been done to prevent that. That's just should be part of the standard routine. But I think Andrew Chin is absolutely right. Given the sheer amount of water, and Greg, you've probably seen the Kimu River and what happened there. It wasn't about stormwater drains. That river just burst its banks and flooded over everything because it couldn't cope with 200 millimetres of water. That's the equivalent of a month and a half winter rain in Kimu on one night, and that's the obvious reason for it. But we will look at any questions that are raised about stormwater systems and whether any other preventive measures could be put in place or would have helped.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. Councillor Newman, please.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Really encouraging news from you regarding the prioritisation of Auckland for the Pfizer vaccine. Is it your understanding that the most likely option at this stage from government is that they will be able to negotiate for a greater supply imported earlier than what was anticipated? Or is it your expectation that government will have to reallocate from the existing supply in New Zealand and ask DHBs outside of Metro Auckland to change the schedule for vaccinations in those DHBs?
Yeah, well, obviously the former is preferable. And in the discussions I've had with government, they are working really hard to try to find a way of boosting the supply of vaccines. We're fine when we get to October. I think there's 4 million doses coming in October. The real question will be in the last week of September. But I have heard the Minister in charge of COVID-19 saying that if they did have to slow down the rest of the country, they would do that. I've been pretty careful in how I've framed this. If you've heard any of my comments in the media, I've said, look, we're not asking for special treatment because we're Auckland. We're asking for a risk-based approach, just as we determined the making available of the vaccine according, first of all, to if you're a border worker, and then if you had comorbidities, then if you were older. It has to be based on risk. And the overwhelming evidence is that Auckland, because it has the quarantine facilities and it is the gateway city, is at greater risk. And on that basis and that basis alone, priority should be given to maintaining the high level of vaccinations that we're currently getting in Auckland. So if they need to, though, they might slow down the rest of the country. But my hope is that they'll be able to get more vaccines in so we can keep the momentum up everywhere.
Thank you, Mayor. Now I'll go to Councillor Stewart. Councillor Stewart, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Daniel sort of asked part of it, but one of the concerns that I have, and I just wondered if the Mayor can ask the government, can we look at even getting more of the vaccine? In Israel, apparently they've done a lot of studies, and the 2 shots are not going to work. They're saying we need to have a 3rd booster shot. And I think after the 3rd booster shot, I think we need to just make sure we've got a supply of vaccines that are coming to New Zealand, because this isn't going away anywhere soon.
Yeah, I've listened to what our epidemiologists have said about this. They say that the jury is still out on the necessity for a booster shot, but if they determine that that is required, they would give that and as a priority to those with comorbidities. With the 4 million doses that I mentioned that are coming in October, that's obviously on top of what we're also getting in September, would have a surplus that would enable us to start doing booster shots should they be required. And I'm sure the government will be on to the fact that if it is determined that that booster shot is necessary, and that may well be the case, then they'd need to get on and making sure that we've got the order in for those extra shots. They are quite keen, I think, to remain with Pfizer rather than using other vaccines, but nobody's ruled out the fact that other vaccines that have been approved, such as the AstraZeneca, might be used, although there's a degree of caution about some groups that might react with blood clotting to that. Very small, but even a small number, as we saw with one person dying of the COVID from a heart inflammation, it does make big news. So they're trying to stick with the Pfizer to the extent possible.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Councillor Stewart. I'll take 2 more questions and then we will move into our agenda. Councillor Walker first, and then finally Councillor Henderson.
Have a question around the Kumu River flooding issue, which is part of the larger Kaipara catchment. Have we done the modelling for that catchment to indicate these kind of scenarios? Because if you've got a rainfall event, there's a certain amount of predictability for flooding in that catchment, and has been for a long time.
Yeah, look, I'm conscious, predictability or otherwise, that this is the 2nd highest level of rainfall in the area since records were first taken, and that at that level of rainfall, all of your normal plans go out the window. But in terms of scenario planning, Wayne, I think that's a question you need to direct to Healthy Waters. I don't have that specificity of information.
Thank you, Mayor. And finally, Councillor Henderson.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just really quickly, a quick comment to sort of thank colleagues that have reached out to Linda and I. We've really appreciated kind of people getting in touch and checking on us and seeing we're okay and if there's anything we need. Because, yeah, it's been a long few days for us sort of handling the flood response. So thanks, guys. Just a really quick question around the guidance that we can offer to the community around operation of the transfer station. So I'm getting a lot of messages and emails around where can we put the debris, and within a COVID-4 structure, just kind of want to relay something to the community as quick as I can on where they should put their debris and kind of operation of the transfer station. So do we have that level of detail?
Yeah, they're still working on that. On the call that I did at 7:15 this morning with Rachel Kelleher, they're working through the details on that. The details that I can give are the ones that I have already, that the Waitakere transfer station will be available, will open specifically for those people who make calls that have flood damaged property that need to dump material there. There is a question, insurance sometimes covers the cost of that, and the insurance companies may well be providing the skips, etc., to provide that. And I think they were wanting to work with the insurance companies to see if we could work in tandem to help with this aspect of the problem. But I am expecting more information later in the day, Shane. And if Claire Rourke's on the line, I think she is, if she can make a note of that, and we'll get it directly to you. Just to advise you and Linda as well, I am going to try and get out to Piha and to Bethel's on Saturday probably, I can't do it before then. I'm being very careful about when I visit because, you know, unfortunately I can't take a carload of people. I do it in isolation, but generally meet with emergency services when I'm out there. But I'll let you know the details of what I'm trying to do on Saturday when they come through as well. So thanks for that, and thanks to you and Linda for the work that you put in your areas, and Greg, I'm sure you've been doing the same in your patch. It's a pretty tough time when your constituents are faced with that sort of thing, and I will come through with further information as it becomes available to me.
Cool, thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for that update. Very valuable. Some good information there. It's great to see our organisation, Auckland Council, respond so strongly and quickly. I do acknowledge the councillors from our west there, from Councillor Sayers on the northern part of the west to Councillor Henderson and Councillor Cooper for the work that they've been doing as well, and all work undertaken under level 4 constraints as well. Not easy, but it's been all hands to the pump, so to speak, out there. The local boards as well. I know we've got local board chair Phelan Perry is also a Fire and Emergency New Zealand member who's been out there right through the night working as well, or nights plural. But there are many other local board members who have been pitching in as best they can. So acknowledge all the elected members, not forgetting our staff who have also, under level 4 constraints, had to undertake this emergency work. So congratulations. I know there's a lot more work to be done out west and in our COVID response as well. Thank you, Mayor, for that briefing. Very valuable. Members, will now proceed to item 8, and I will move accordingly the recommendations that you received last night, and Councillor Bartley will second. So introducing item 8, which is the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and the direction of that statement for us to remove car parking minimums through consequential plan changes to the Auckland Unitary Plan. This, members, was well workshopped on the 28th of July. It's been presented to the Local Board Chairs Forum on the 12th of July. Members of this committee at the workshop and post the workshop lodged a number of questions. Those questions were replied to in writing. You received that by email yesterday, 1 September. At the agenda run-through, members, we discussed making some small changes to the recommendations to have them better reflect the discussion that we had at our workshop, and also reflecting on the questions that were raised. I've had further input from Councillor Dalton, and there's been a small change since you received the recommendations last night, and you'll be able to see that change. The Roman, or under C, Roman 6, which was in the recommendations that you received last night, the Roman 6 has now come out and it's been replaced by E. And so Councillor Dalton, in fact, is seconding this. I should change that. I'm moving and Councillor Dalton is seconding this, my correction. So that is the motions that I think best reflect the workshops, the inquiry that we've had into this matter through the workshop, and through the questions that have been lodged. And these have been worked up with members and our staff. Now, I'll now introduce our staff who will proceed with this item. And it is led by John Dugood, our General Manager of Plans and Places, Erin Shields, who is the team leader, Regional Northwestern Islands. We also have staff from Auckland Transport with us to answer questions. Claire Kovacic, Principal Transport Planner, and Andrew McGill, Head of Integrated Network Planning. And I've also asked Michael Roth, who's our Lead Transport Advisor in Council's Growth Transport Infrastructure Strategy Unit, to be with us well. So the purpose of today, following our workshop and the questions that have been lodged, is to endorse the plan change and note that the car parking minimums are required to be removed from the Auckland Unitary Plan, including the Hauraki Gulf Islands section by February next year. And we're also endorsing a suite of consequential technical amendments to provide some clarity. And we're asking for staff to investigate a range of matters, and they are listed at C Roman 1 to 5. And then there is the new E, noting the consequences to communities who drive by necessity, not choice, because of current public transport inequality. That's emphasising the task in front of us, which I think needs to be addressed by us and Auckland Transport as we get a better balance in the provision of public transport. Thank you, Councillor Dalton, for that. So I will now, well, the final part is to delegate authority and request the findings of the investigations come back to the committee. I will now hand to John Duguid to commence this item on behalf of the staff. With you, John.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Chair. I'm actually just going to hand straight over to our team leader, Aaron Shields, to run through the presentation. It's very self-explanatory, and Aaron will do a great job of taking the committee through. So, Aaron, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good morning, Mr. Chair, Mr. Mayor, councillors and IMSB members. By way of introduction, I'm Aaron Shields, team leader in the Northwest Planning Unit, and I have been involved in the development of all of the policy direction setting that you as a committee have undertaken over the last few months to respond to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. This is possibly it's the next item in this tranche of policy direction that establishes the basis upon which we as staff can begin to prepare changes to the Unitary Plan, and in this instance the Hauraki Gulf Islands Plan, in relation to the removal of car parking minimums. I've got a short presentation, it's about 10 slides long. Maybe if I can run through it. I'm not sure if we take questions as we go, or shall we do that at the end?
We will take questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you. So Kalinda is operating the presentation, so I'll just talk with her as and when I need to move on to the next slide. So the item today, as the Chair indicated, has been workshop with you as the Planning Committee, and we also discussed it with the local board's chairs in their regular forum, and both of those happened in July. And so there's three areas of focus. This is all about the removal of car parking minimums as required by Policy 11 of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. Government has decided that this should happen without any need to go through a statutory plan change process, and so we as council do not have a choice about whether we remove the minimum requirements across the zones and the transport chapters. What that has generated for us in our consideration of this issue is the need for some consequential amendments to the Unitary Plan, and I have the Unitary Plan there particularly because the Hauraki Gulf Islands Plan is a different document, and it doesn't have some of the approaches to parking that the Unitary Plan has, and it doesn't have, other than in Waiheke, the extent of growth that we're experiencing on mainland Auckland. And so as part of this agenda item, we are recommending that you approve the investigation into 5 other matters as a consequence of removing the minimums. Next slide, thank you, Kalinda. So just to provide you with the actual text of Policy 11, I won't read it, but it is there, and it has got two arms. One is about the removal of the car parking minimums, and the second one is about an encouragement for councils to undertake the development of comprehensive parking management plans if that is the appropriate approach. So there's two arms to this particular policy, and this report mostly deals with the first part of that. Next slide, thank you. So the NPS UD requires us to remove these by next February, being February 2022. And it clearly indicates that accessible car parking provisions can be retained in our Unitary plan and the HGI plan, and also other more technical and engineering elements of parking dimensions and manoeuvring standards can be retained. So this must be done without using a plan change process, and so the effect of that direction from government is that public cannot make a submission on the removal. It happens as part of our regular updates to the Unitary plan. Next slide, thank you, Kalinda. As I said earlier, we've identified a number of consequential technical amendments. To reach this point, we've audited both the Unitary plan and the HGI plan, and we've identified numerous instances where the text needs to be changed, and there's a typo there I see, and the exiting should be existing. Apology for that. What we've found is that if we take out the requirements or the words related to the provision of minimum car parks, often we have policies and assessment criteria and standards that need to be adjusted because they no longer make sense without those words. If you can imagine a lengthy policy that covers numerous topics, and in the middle of it there is a statement about parking minimums, we take those words out and the whole policy no longer reads correctly. So we are heading towards recommending a plan change to address those consequential requirements under the RMA. The NPS does allow us to do very minor consequential amendments, but some of the amendments that we have identified we consider need to be considered in a plan change and allow the public to make submissions on those. Next slide, thank you. As we covered in our workshop with the committee and with the local board chairs, we've had a number of matters identified for further investigation, and we are asking and recommending that you direct us to do further work on these matters. You can see there are 5 items, and we expect that these 5 items may require amendments to the Auckland Unitary Plan, the HGI plan, or both, depending on where we get to with our investigations. Next slide, thank you. So the first issue of accessible car parking. This is an interesting and slightly technical issue where the council relies on the building code to identify how many accessible car parks we need to install in developments. And that calculation is done on the basis of how many minimum car parks we require. And so when we remove the minimums from the Unitary plan, there's no ability to calculate the number of accessible car parks. So we need to, and we're investigating the development of a method to calculate the number of accessible car parks that we need to have provided as part of developments. So that work is underway, and we consider that that is a matter that might need to enter the plan via a plan change. Next slide, thank you. From our urban design unit, we've also been investigating the situations that have started to occur since 2016 when the Unitary Plan was made operative, where in some of our zones there is already no requirement for on-site parking, and so where those sites are narrow and long, we are seeing the establishment of private pedestrian access ways to enable people to get to their dwellings at the rear of the site. What we've found with the Unitary Plan is that there aren't standards that manage the quality of these particular access ways, and so we are seeing some very poor built outcomes. We anticipate that with the removal of car parking minimums, we're going to see more of this development solution presented as part of applications, and so we're keen to investigate the ability to enable the assessment of these pedestrian access way in terms of universal access, emergency services access, for personal and public safety on the access way itself, to enable loading in terms of people moving in and out of the buildings and the receipt of delivery parcels, etc. And also look at the on-site amenity. And those two photos are two current examples to help you understand the sorts of issues that we are identifying. Next slide, thank you. Bicycle storage and access is an emerging issue as well, and we in the Unitary Plan require cycle parking in some situations on larger scale developments. That is a matter that we've been considering requires some further investigation, particularly in terms of the design of cycle access ways and where secure sheltered cycle parking facilities can be located and how they operate on the site. So we consider that that's a matter that needs investigation further. Next slide, thank you. Electric vehicle charging was also raised as part of the conversations through the Planning Committee workshop and with the local board chairs forum. And the Unitary Plan currently has no requirements for electric vehicle charging. However, we do have targets in our other council policy documents that we need to work towards. It's considered that charging facilities will help to develop and achieve these targets, and we understand that on-street facilities are not currently anticipated. So that's another matter that needs a bit more investigation before we can determine any amendments to the Unitary Plan. Next slide, thank you. And here's just some photos of pick-up and drop-off and emergency service access. We've talked with our emergency service providers and they are concerned about delays in providing life-saving services, particularly if there's difficulties accessing the site and moving up and down the long pedestrian access ways that may start to occur more commonly across Auckland. There are also reported issues with the width of these access ways to accommodate their ladders and stretchers. And on a less sort of urgent type of service vehicle, there's no ability in some places to pick up and drop off people and or goods or furniture unless it's some way from the development. So we're seeing that this sort of pick up and drop off relies on roadside access, and that's not always available because of no stopping rules. And that may then equally knock on into our transport network in terms of cars illegally stopping adjacent to sites to pick up and drop off, clogging up the streets and causing issues for the wider network. So there's a bit more investigation recommended in this space as well. Next slide, thank you. So this is the last slide, and I wanted to just indicate to the committee the time scales that we're looking at here. In September, we're looking to engage with mana whenua, local boards and stakeholders, and we're already well engaged with some of those stakeholders. That's been getting prepared in anticipation of this agenda item. In October, we look to visit all of the local boards during their business meetings and discuss this issue and seek any formal feedback from the boards on the draft plan changes, which are not yet fully drafted, but we've been working on those in the background. In November, we hope to bring back to the Planning Committee delegates the technical plan change, which is the consequential amendments, for their approval. Now that is possibly going to occur in advance of the matters that we're seeking approval to further investigate, and that is simply to support our resource consent teams when the minimums are deleted in February 2022, so that the consequential amendments can be progressed as far as possible so that they are well supported in their processing of resource consent applications. In November, we will also bring back a report on the outcomes of the investigations for the whole committee to consider. So that brings me to the end of the slides. Should I hand back to you now, Chair Darby?
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for the socialisation of this important topic with the key stakeholders, and they've been numerous following our workshop and the engagement that we've had. John, can I come to you at this point, and just there's been some changes and there are more clarifications in the recommendations. John, are you best, or Erin best, to take us through those, just to make sure that the members of the committee are abreast of the reasons behind these changes? Is that with you, John, or Erin?
I'm happy to do that, Chair Darby. John may wish to jump in and add further comment.
Erin, can we, we'll see, thank you.
Yeah, so with recommendation A, this is a noting recommendation for the committee to note that we will have to remove the car parking requirements. And it's a noting recommendation so that the committee can be formally note that this is going to happen. With the second recommendation in B, we're seeking the committee's endorsement of the development of a plan change to address the consequential amendments to the text to clarify and provide consistency within the plans and to ensure the effects of the removal of the minimums can still be addressed. The third one has been amended, and these are the 5 items that we are recommending the committee endorse further investigation on. Do you want me to go through each in turn?
Yes, I think they are the key ones,
Okay.
I think, and then going to the E as well. So
Okay.
I think we do need to cover these, please.
Okay, so in Roman numeral 1, thank you, somebody's zooming it up, which is helpful for my eyes. I appreciate that. So the Roman numeral 1 is about the accessible car parking, and this relates to the issue from the presentation about how we calculate the number of accessible car parks where they're required and as part of development. This Roman numeral 2 is about private pedestrian and bicycle/micro mobility access where no vehicle access is proposed. So this relates to the issue where now there is no, or where there will be no requirement for car parking on site. Developers are opting to not put a driveway in and use that land rather to provide more housing. So that's where the private pedestrian access ways are starting to become very important to access the entire site, and there's an amendment there to include consideration of bicycle and micro mobility modes. The third Roman numeral is about on-site bicycle and micro-mobility parking. So this is so that people who are using these modes of transport are well provided for on the site to manage their ability to use these types of vehicles. Roman numeral 4 is about the charging of electric vehicles, and this is being changed to include the point that where parking is proposed, and this is important in terms of the MPSUD requires the council to remove minimum requirements for car parking, but it does not preclude developers from proposing as part of their development to include car parks. So where parking is proposed by developers, the provision of electricity connections that enable installation of compliant smart EV chargers. So this is recognizing that more and more people are utilizing electric vehicles, and so where new development occurs and car parking is proposed by the developer, that EV parking is included in the parking provision. And then Roman numeral 5 is about the on-site pickup and drop-off and loading facilities. There are some concerns that in some cases where there's no on-road parking or access or stopping along a road is prohibited, that people have to walk a long way with rather heavy loads to get stuff in and out of the counts, in and out of the buildings. So yes, the 5 matters for investigation will be referred back to the committee for the committee's further investigation. And then the new recommendation E that notes the consequences to communities who drive by necessity, not choice, because of current public transport inequality. And that's a matter that has been brought forward by Councillor Darby and Councillor Dalton. The last one, being F, is more of a machinery type recommendation relating to the ability to approve under delegation the consequential technical plan change for public notification. We've included this because we may be in the place where if the wider investigation referred to requires a longer time frame, we don't want the consequential technical changes to be delayed, because they're important to support our consent teams as they process resource consent applications after February 2022.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you. And just on the E, members, while I do support the E and will be putting a vote of support to E, I acknowledge Councillor Dalton for the work that she's undertaken with our staff over the last couple of days to bring that particular work stream to our attention. Thank you, Councillor Dalton, and I'm sure you will take your speaking turn to explain that. Members, I do want to take you to just back to one section, and that was the C Roman 4. The original wording had it that there would be a requirement, sorry, it's moving around, but it's stable now, for developers to provide on-site vehicle charging even when there was no vehicle parking as was proposed. Now that's almost, you know, it's a contradiction of the national policy statement in some ways. It was probably just a wording error, so we've tidied it up, because what it would do would actually require a developer to put in charging facilities even when they didn't have any, they'd made the choice to not provide car parking. So we've just clarified that. So where the developer does propose parking, remember, they are not prohibited from proposing parking. We just don't require them to provide minimums of parking anymore once these plan changes have been made. So where parking is proposed, the provision of electricity connections, so the core infrastructure, might be required, subject to our investigations. Not necessarily the smart EV chargers themselves. Okay, it's just making sure that in the future you can provide the chargers because the core electricity infrastructure is provided. That's the clarification there. John, I just want to check with you, John Dogood. Is there anything, John, that you need to add at this point?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've only just managed to hop back onto the call 30 seconds ago. I was away for about 4 minutes, but I did catch the beginning of Aaron walking through the recommendations and discussing the amendments, and actually caught most of that. So no, I think that's all covered off. Recommendation E, Aaron noted that was something put forward by Councillor Dalton and yourself, and I guess that's just acknowledging that you know, this removal of car parking minimums will have differing impacts on different parts of the region relative to their access to public transport, and so there really is just quite an important note about those impacts, but addressing that is a much wider program of work over an extended period of time, really. So apologies, that's all for me. Thanks, Councillor Darley.
Thank you, John. So John and Erin, your teams, because there's Auckland Transport and the Transport Strategy Unit are in support of these recommendations as well. I just need to probably get that. Megan, can I go to you? Can you, as Chief of Strategy, confirm that the recommendations before us are supported by the collaborative work of all?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and morning, everyone. Yes, I can. The other comment I just wanted to make was another change just in C is we're reflecting that these changes or the investigation that we're doing won't mean that all of this needs to be a plan change to the unitary plan. So there's words in there saying or other means. There may be different ways that we can still achieve these outcomes. It may not be just through plan changes. It's really important to understand that sometimes regulating things doesn't actually help. So we're just providing a little bit more clarity and structure that when we investigate them and we come back to you, it may not mean that plan changes are required, or they may not be the best way to achieve these outcomes. So that's also part of C. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, they are outlined. Now, we had a circulation last night, 1 September, of a comprehensive list of replies to numerous questions that's been circulated. But now I've got further questions, happy to take them, and we'll start with Member Henderson, please. Member Henderson, kia ora.
Kia ora, Chair. I just want to ask a couple of questions with regards to the Māori impact statement. I think it's para 48. Now, there's a mention of planned engagement with mana whenua on a number of the related issues. Can you share some of the more details around what the planned engagement is, and if this engagement is going to inform the investigation of possible amendments later on to the plan?
Thank you, Member Henderson. Erin Shields?
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair, it's Erin here. Yeah, we expect to connect with all of the mana whenua entities across the region. We expect that we will need to do some work with each of them to explain this particular policy endeavour, and then enable a way for them to provide feedback that then feeds back into the policy considerations and plan change preparation. We expect that that's going to be happening through September and October.
So will that lead to an investigation of possible amendments to the plan, or is it before, is it during, or is it after?
Through the chair, it's during. We've already we've done the work in terms of identifying where all the minimums are that need to be removed, and we've got groups of people working on the beginning of the investigation on each of these, just because the time frames are short. So it's not, we won't be presenting a blank slate to iwi, rather it's more, this is where we've got to, this is where we're heading. What do you think about those responses?
I have some issues with the answer to that. With regard to the marae, has there been any consideration given to how car parking provisions might or might not impact on marae facilities if they were to be expand? You know, like marae often provide a raft of community and health services, and those, I suppose, just like Papakura and Manurua at the moment, they have high demands of parking.
Through the chair, the requirements of the NPSUD don't mean that people have to remove car parks that exist, and people can offer to have car parking and can increase that amount. So it's not like we'll be taking existing parking away, and if people want to provide it or expand the numbers, that is certainly available to them.
So that, yeah, so just get this right, straight in my head. This is not about removing anybody's parking spaces. This is about tomorrow going forward.
That's correct.
Cool. Look, just briefly, that point that I mentioned about the engagement plan. Do you think you'd be able to put something in front of IMSB to say, well, here's what we're doing? There may be some questions we might need answered. Is that possible?
Through the chair, yes, that's very possible.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
So we're about to provide some information to local boards, so we can certainly provide that to the IMSB, and we can attend to that offline if that's.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Henry. I will now go to Councillor Newman.
Thank you, Chair. My question probably is best addressed by officers from Auckland Transport if they're on the call, and I refer to paragraph 14 of the report. The report provides information commissioned by Auckland Transport around car ownership, and it indicates that over 92% of households in Auckland have a car. With respect to that data, my first question is, has Auckland Transport canvassed as to why people need a car? My working assumption is that they have a car because they need it, not because it's a luxury, it's a necessity. If 92% of people need a car, moving forward, one presumes that that particular ratio of those who need a car versus those who don't won't change significantly, notwithstanding the fact that this is a very arbitrary reform coming in for future developments. Can Auckland Transport comment on that? That's my first question.
Thank you, Councillor. And I will go to Claire Kovacic or Andrew McGill.
It's Hamish Bunn here. I'm here in place of...
Hamish, welcome.
Thank you. I'm here in place of Andrew. Yeah, certainly this was the work that we did looking at car ownership as per the 2018 census. And yes, it demonstrated that overwhelmingly Aucklanders or Auckland households tend to own vehicles, and in fact tend to own 1.9 vehicles per household. I would hope that the kinds of changes that we will make with improved public transport and shifting to active modes will reduce that proportion over time. But I think it's kind of difficult to see it getting to a point where you know, a huge proportion of Aucklanders don't own a car. So I think we can expect some degree of car ownership to continue, hopefully at lower levels than today. So that's the response.
Thank you. Hamish, back to you, Councillor Newman.
Well, yeah, I would hope so too, but 92% is a very high number, and I'm just wondering at what number do we need to get to reduce the risk or appropriately address the risk of very clogged streets. And I'd just like Auckland Transport officers to indicate whether they're aware that the city centre arguably has the highest level of public transport choice available to its residents. And yet only a few weeks ago we saw one car park bay auctioned for $288,000, which indicates that the demand for car parks remains at a premium, even in that location which has the greatest option for an alternate to the private vehicle.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, absolutely. I think we're fair to say that we're kind of concerned about the potential flow-on effects about the removal of car parking minimums, particularly in the outer areas of the urban area where car parking tends to be higher per household, and so we're expecting to need to put in place car parking management over time to be able to deal with those kinds of implications and ensure that there's appropriate balance between traffic movement and that there's nothing occurring that would preclude further road space reallocation towards more sustainable modes. So we do see this as one of the challenges of the direction that's come through from government. But we'll just need to work with that kind of policy direction that we've got.
One final question did you have, Councillor Newman?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And Hamish has just walked us through to, I think, what will be the next consequence of this as we, and maybe it's for plans and places, if one of the officers could comment on this. So if we have no car parking minimums, and we have greater parking management to restrict or to price on-street parking, could we anticipate that developers who retain car parks, off-street parking as part of their development, actually with these changes, the price of that property is likely to significantly increase, to try and meet the demand of property owners or aspiring property owners who want to own those particular properties, those dwellings with that off-street parking? The price of the real estate is actually going to go up. Is that a consequence of this?
I'm not. You're talking about the consequence, or are you asking Hamish for his opinion on property values? I don't think that's Hamish.
I'm not going to talk to property values.
Hamish. I said plans and places.
Plans and places. Look, I do have our Chief of Strategy with us for this meeting as well. So I'll go to Megan Tyler, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I'm not sure if I can answer that question. I think you make but I'm not really in a position to be too clear about whether that will result in the situation you're thinking about. Very happy though to chat offline or provide you some more advice if you need that.
Thank you, Councillor Newman, for those questions. I will now go to Councillor Filipina, please. Councillor Filipina.
Tēnā koe, Chair, and tēnā koutou to our staff. I've got three quick questions, and they relate to C2 on your recommendations, Chair. So the first one is, my understanding is that there's no provision in the Unitary Plan at the moment that states that stairs cannot be part of the pathway. We know what the issue is with stairs, especially with our older generation, mobility impairment, caregivers with prams. So the question is, how will people with mobility impairment, parents, etc., get safely to the curbside with the rubbish bins? And I note that Councillor Collins mentioned that, but there's also safety around two other questions I'm going to pose. So, I mean, how are we going to address that, and is that going to be part of the investigation under C2?
Now, I'm not sure who's best placed to take that question. Aaron, are you prepared?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I can answer that. The matter that you raise is a real one, and we're seeing sort of large areas of the curbside taken up with various recycling and rubbish bins. So this issue is mainly addressed through the work of our urban design staff in the processing of the resource consent applications. And so the provision of those types of services for the house or the buildings or the dwellings is part of the assessment of that. So it's on site, it tends to be where are these best stored during the week while people are taking the rubbish and recycling from their house to their bins. And the issue that you talk about is on collection day, what happens then? And that's where we're looking at sort of loading and the pickup and drop off provisions as part of Roman numeral 1. So yeah, and as part of that, we're also looking at sort of situations where stairs are used to get up to the level of the dwellings. So I think the short answer is yes, it is part of our investigation, Councillor Filipaina.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, because as we know, the highest locations of injuries in New Zealand are our community and stairs. Look, the second question I have is around the gradient with stairs, because I note in your presentation, slide 8 of 12, the private pedestrian access. I mean, I've seen photos that have a gradient as you previously said, and those issues are again something that we need to be aware of. Is the gradient, and are there going to be rules proposed around the footpath gradient, etc., with the steepness?
Yeah, through the chair, that's another issue that we would look at. I can't say I know much about that. That's much more of a on-site urban design issue, and our the staff from those urban design unit will be part of that assessment and investigation, and what might be required in the Unitary Plan to enable us to attend to that in the resource consent processing.
Thank you. And Chair, just at this stage, one last question and also request. The question, the last one, is again around the safety. Councillor Collins chaired the safety collective Tamaki Makoto that's made up of many of our organisations around safety. Now, they have concerns in regards to lighting, the gradient. So will the footpath and the quality and the lighting also be part of the investigation? And my request is, can the Safety Collective Tamaki Makoto, which is presented to the PACE Committee, whether if they could also be part of the consultative process.
And through the chair again, yes, we can certainly include that group. We will need to be contacting them through September and October to hear from them and receive their views. So we'll do that. And we were also looking at those very issues of the design of the footpath and the surface in terms of anti-slip solutions. So that's all part of that investigation.
Thank you, and Ngabi, Chair, thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor Filipina. Councillor Casey, you asked a question. I think it is resolved, but I'll give you the opportunity to ask staff for some clarification, Councillor Casey.
Oh, thanks. Maybe you could just summarise the feedback, if you would, from the Seniors Panel and the Disability Advisory Panel.
Thank you. Erin, can you summarise that feedback?
Yes, just one moment. Thanks.
And the Urban Design Forum? Urban Design Forum, Seniors Panel, Disability Panel?
Yeah, so far to date, we've engaged with our council family in the form of Auckland Transport, our consents teams and our urban design unit. We've also attended the Universal Design Forum, the Seniors Advisory Panel and the Disability Advisory Panel. What we've come across is that their feedback is consistent with each other. They really identify the lack of on-site parking, including accessible parking, will reduce their accessibility and independence in terms of the choices they make in terms of where they live and how they live. They're also concerned about the effect of door-to-door services and how they might be delivered, particularly in terms of online purchasing of products. They also raised the issue of the need for well-lit accessways that are free of obstructions, and that comes to the issue of where you put things like wheelie bins, etc., and that they're sufficiently wide so people can get past, a mother with a pram and other people with getting around each other in those spaces. And also they've raised issues associated with the provision of specialist disability services to the dwellings and how they are provided for in terms of spaces to park and accessing into the dwellings and getting people from the dwellings into the specialist mobility vehicles. Again, our emergency services have explained to us the operational issues that they're already facing, and that includes increased response time to get to sites, and then also increased issues getting equipment to dwellings that need to be accessed for the emergency service. So that was really the summary of 3 or 4 meetings, if that helps, Councillor Casey.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Erin. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Casey. I will now take a question from Councillor Watson, please. Councillor Watson, your call.
Erin, I just wonder if you could clarify a couple of parts of the report, mainly point 30 in relation to C4. So our resolution as it stands is where parking is proposed, the provision of electricity connections that enable installation of chargers. That's where parking is proposed. In the actual report at point 30, there's a couple of statements there that really, in my eye anyway, point to the inadequacy or the potential inadequacy of that resolution. So at point 30, we're told that the transition to electric vehicles is a key component of efforts to significantly reduce transport emissions, and we have the targets in Auckland's climate plan there, 40% electric by 2030, 80% by 2050. And we're also told there, and this is really the crux of the issue as far as I see it, even if no formal car parking is provided, it is still expected that most households will own a vehicle, and therefore some shared charging facilities will be required. Now, that's not what we seem to be saying in that resolution. We're essentially saying that in the first instance, if there is no parking provided, there will be no provision, which means anyone in those sorts of living arrangements will be essentially precluded from that move to electric vehicles, which could be significant. I mean, if you listen to James Shaw, that's certainly what he's saying. He's expecting a huge uptake. So I'm just trying to reconcile what seem to be contradictory elements there. Aaron, can you give me a hand on that one?
Through the chair, thank you for that, Councillor Watson. This particular paragraph was written with the earlier version of the recommendation in mind. We've received assistance from Auckland Transport in terms of this, and the sentence that begins, even if no formal car parking is provided, it is still expected that most households will own a vehicle. That comes from the work of AT and was answered earlier about 92% of households. So that sort of is where that part of that sentence came from. And then on that basis, I have written in there that therefore some shared charging facilities will be required. That subsequently changed in the recommendation, but we didn't really have time to change this particular sentence in the report. So you're right that it does run a bit counter to what the recommendation now says. And the point of the new recommendation is that where it is proposed by developers, that there is the ability of council to seek the provision of electric vehicle charging facilities. In terms of the wider issue that you raised, that there's numerous instances where potentially people won't be able to utilize electric vehicles because there is no overnight or charging facilities available. I understand the point you're making there, and I am thinking that this is really an evolution in terms of our transport mode, and so over time I think that issue will resolve as houses are redeveloped and more ability to access charging facilities are provided on that basis. So it's not an overnight solution, and I think the issue that you raise is real and will continue to endure for some time, but over time it will actually see the provision of more housing with EV charging facilities available for people. It's not a great answer, but that's what I understand.
No, I appreciate that, Aaron. It's quite helpful because it basically confirms what I thought. I guess just in terms of that provision of provision, and I'm just trying to think of the practicalities given some of the some of the photos that have been put up of various developments that are occurring already. That provision of charging facilities, even where, say, a low number of parking is provided, that obviously, and I think of the situation in the council building itself, where there's a limited number of charging facilities. One car essentially can monopolise that space overnight or during the day, but for big lengths of period of time. Are we moving to any consideration of the practicalities of that in this investigation in terms of, you know, just how many such connections would be required, and the space that goes with it, because of course the car still has to be parked somewhere.
Yeah, so through the chair, that is part of our investigation. Once these EV charging facilities are installed, maybe in a parking bay on site, the council doesn't have much ability to influence how the people who use that behave, and so that's a self-regulating situation, I'd expect, and one would hope that people would get along and respect the need of others who have EV vehicles, so that they can all access the charging facility as and when they need. But yes, this will be part of that investigation in terms of ensuring that where it is proposed that the facilities are accessible. I'd imagine that there might be, in some situations, parking spaces for charging EV, but the agreement amongst the owners of the dwellings might be that you don't park there long term, and long term you may be required to go and park on the street along with everybody else. So does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think it again, it reinforces that concern. So thanks, Aaron.
Just to be clear, Aaron, on that C3, as it was originally worded, and I know things are a bit rushed at that point, it suggested that, sorry, not C3, C4, that even when car parking wasn't proposed in a development, there would be a requirement to provide electric charging facilities for vehicles, which, I mean, you've only got to work that one out pretty quickly. That would require access and the provision of a car park.
Yeah, that's correct.
Which is in contradiction to the MPS UD direction to remove the car parkings.
Yeah.
So I just want to hear it from you and anybody else on this call, AT or transport strategy advisors that have contributed to this, that the C4 is a more accurate reflection of the MPSUD to remove minimum car parking provisions. Is that a yes or a no?
Through the chair, that's a yes from me. When I drafted that recommendation, I didn't consider that proposition that this could be a backdoor for the council to provide car parking where the MPS is required, that we remove that ability. So for me, the revision better reflects the MPSUD.
Now, we've got some other people from our staff on this call, so I just do want to clarify this. Hamish, on the C4, do you have any comment? And also Michael Roth from our Transport Strategy Unit Council, do you have any comment there, please? I just need to hear it from both AT and our Transport Strategy team on C4, please.
Thank
Hamish,
you.
can I take you first?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, well, it was kind of a consideration as to whether an EV charging facility and associated bay that would be used at a short term could be considered a car park in the context of, you know, long-term vehicle storage that's allocated to a particular person under the MPSUD. If the view is that that is the case, then, you know, I take the view of the planners who are more familiar with this particular area. I mean, what I think we were driving at there is a concern that, you know, that if you have a substantial developments without any sort of off-street charging facilities, then those developments would essentially be either reliant on on-street charging, which AT at this point doesn't intend to allow, or provision of commercial facilities, which may develop over time. However, you know, much of the fleet in terms of the kinds of vehicles that we're coming on still have relatively sort of EV type or plug-in hybrid type things, have relatively limited range. So we're just concerned about that being something that might be an impediment to EV take-up. However, if that's the interpretation of the NPSUD, then I guess that's the case, and there would just be a real challenge there, I think, about those properties being able to switch to EV over the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamish. Michael Roth, are you with the school? Michael?
Yes, Michael Roth here, through the chair. In our view, there was doubt on point 4 initially that it could be construed as requiring, you know, vehicle access and a parking spot on the site. So the rewording removes that doubt, bearing in mind that most developers are likely to continue to choose to provide parking for cars because most households want the parking. This clarifies that we want to investigate how we can ensure that the new developments provide for electric vehicles so that it is not a difficult or expensive issue to add the charging capacity later on, because the industry has already provided the electrical connection so that the electric vehicle can be easily charged when car parking is provided, without us forcing any developer to provide parking. Also with that, electric vehicles, the market has adopted quite a lot in the last few years, and although most people do home charging, where there is no home garage available, there's a lot of fast chargers currently being installed and planned, and a lot of destination and workplace chargers. So there will be EV owners who are able to charge their vehicles quite conveniently and safely, even when they don't have a off-street car park. So we support that.
Thank you, Michael. And members, I should have introduced Michael. I did earlier, but Michael's just joined us, or I think about 6 to 8 weeks ago. We poached him from the city of Brisbane. You can hear the twang, and Michael is our lead transport advisor in the Growth, Transport and Infrastructure Strategy Unit within Auckland Council. So, Michael, I'd like to welcome you. I think this is your first presentation in part at the Planning Committee, and we'll be hearing more from you. So thank you. I'll now go to John Dogood, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to add to this discussion and the point about C4 potentially, as previously worded, flying in the face of the NPSUD, which is requiring us to remove the minimums. You know, that's where we're at, but we haven't sought a legal sort of review of that. We haven't really, you know, given an in-depth analysis as to whether it might be possible to still require a charging facility and that be quite distinct from being termed a requirement for a car park. So that's why the amendment is there, that we do feel that it does, on the face of it, seem to be contrary to the NPSUD to actually be requiring a space for charging a vehicle when there is no other parking proposed. But look, we can get some legal review on that and have that within the broader scope of this investigation that we're talking about, with a focus on situations where there is parking proposed. But you know, we're not saying we've absolutely got to the bottom of it, and that we shouldn't be investigating that at all. So I'm happy to take a bit of a look at that broader question. It just, on the face of it, seems to be a bit of a problem to go down that path.
Okay, thank you, John. Now I've got questions coming up from 3 councillors, Councillors Walker, Coombe and Fletcher, and I think we'll conclude the questions after Councillor Fletcher. So now going to Councillor Walker, please.
Sure. One of the issues I've raised consistently is around parking for car sharing. Other cities, for example, San Francisco and others provide facilities for car sharing spaces, and that often kicks in around a certain scale. For example, you wouldn't have car sharing for just 2 or 3 apartments. So is that something that we have considered? Particularly given the policies we have around promoting.
Erin, is that for you?
Through the chair, we are aware of that issue. Thank you, Councillor Walker. We wouldn't require a car park on the basis that there is a car share arrangement happening. Again, like the point that has just been made by Michael Roth, that appears to be contrary to the MPSUD to require a car park for that type of vehicle utilisation arrangement. That doesn't preclude developers from providing or proposing spaces for that purpose, should they wish to do so, and we would then manage that space through the Unitary plan as part of the resource consent application.
So what is the difference between a car share space and provision of on-site bicycles and so on, where they're recognised, and the provision of EV charging, which is also recognised? What's the difference between those things and car sharing, which is something that both the government and Auckland Transport promote?
Through the chair again, on-site cycle and micro-mobility access and parking takes up far less space on the site, and so therefore that is in line with the NPSUD approach of freeing up land on site that could or was expected to be used for car parking to enable more dwellings to be built if the developer so chose.
Okay, I guess the context around this as it applies to other cities is, for example, in San Francisco, if you've got 50 apartments, you've got to have one space for car sharing. That's in the downtown area. So it actually goes to the relationship between the provision and scale. Has there been any consideration of any of these things that we're putting up having some scale dimension?
Yeah, through the chair, we have the issue of accessible parking has a scale issue in terms of the calculation of the number of accessible car parks in relation to the number of dwellings, and so we're attending to that matter. We haven't looked at the issue of car sharing and the scale, as you suggest, using the San Francisco example.
Okay, well, I guess my concern is that we do look at these things. The other question I've got is, we mention bicycles and micro-mobility. What about micro cars that are becoming increasingly popular and having provision for those spaces? So it's not a conventional car; it's a micro car. Could be a.
Councillor, that is captured by micro mobility. When we examined the best wording there, we're also considering mobility for older people or people that need mobility scooters and other devices that maybe we don't have a great awareness of at the moment. And through the investigation phase, the intention is to look at all those possible solutions.
So micro mobility includes micro cars. I just want to be very clear on that.
Through the chair, we can certainly look at that. I think the issue is that we're talking about a car, even if it is a small car, and the policy 11 from the MPSUD is clear about the removal of car parking minimums, and so it may be that a car is a car, whether it's a 1967 Cadillac or a modern microcar.
I'm just raising that because overseas cities differentiate. A microcar is not necessarily the same as a car, and when does a bicycle become a tricycle and become motorised and effectively almost becomes a mini car?
Okay, look, I don't think that's
the other
question to be answered. I'll take one final question from you, Councillor. We're up to 4 now.
So the other question I've got just goes to the issue that Councillor Newman raised about car ownership, and are we questioning this? I mean, for example, in the Netherlands, which is flat and has massive cycleways, car ownership is still 54%, and that's even in the cities. So are we questioning how realistic some of this is, particularly in areas outside of downtown Auckland?
Are we questioning what? Sorry, it's not clear what you're asking to be questioned.
Well, the applicability of a what I'd call a worst case scenario where there's no parking in apartment buildings outside of Auckland, yet people still have cars and have to park.
So let's be clear. Can we just be clear that the removal of the car parking minimums does not prohibit a developer or any individual that might like to develop a site from providing car parking? Erin, can we just come to you on, we need to possibly re-emphasise this from your voice, please, Erin.
Yes, through the chair, the clear intention of the MPS around this is to remove council's provisions around minimum car parking. And nowhere does the NPS say that the individual land developer cannot provide car parks. And so if the developer, based on their assessment of the market that they're building for, considers car parking as appropriate, they can integrate that with their wider development.
Thank you. Going to Councillor Coombe, please.
Well, tēnā koe, Mr. Chair. Morena koutou. Thank you to the presenters and the work on this. I have 3 questions, if I may, Mr. Chair, that I'd like to step through. The first one, I mean, the whole reason for removing parking minima, as I understand it, is it provides for more efficient land use, it reduces additional costs on housing, and it provides for choice. So, of course, doesn't force anybody to live without a car park. It just means that people can choose the storage that they need for EVs as well. And I can't find in the report anywhere that sums up the benefits of removing parking minima. So I just wondered who can speak to that. It is kind of obliquely mentioned in different places, but there isn't really a clear statement of that, and I just would like it clarified, please.
Thank you, Councillor Coombe. Erin?
Through the chair, thank you for that, Councillor Coombe. As I understand it, the benefits associated with the removal of car parking is really to enable the land that was formerly used for driveways and parking provision to be re-utilised or utilised to deliver the opportunity for more housing development. In a lot of developments, there is extensive areas of car parking on site that services the existing dwellings, and as I understand it, the approach means that where developers don't need to provide that amount of car parking, they can use that land to deliver more houses. For me, I understand that to be the main intention of the MPS in terms of policy level.
Thank you. I guess I can pick that up further in my comments, but I think that only goes to part of the positives. Just in terms of resolving the issues. I think it's good to see in the presentation those issues. You've got the images there, but it would have been kind of good to have that in the report as well, because it's not clear the issues that we're trying to address. But let's put that as aside, because it's good that it got picked up in the presentation. I also just wanted to go to paragraph 30, but come at it from a slightly different angle, in that the sentence around, even if no formal car parking is provided, it's still expected that most households will own a vehicle. That, I think it has been answered that this came from Auckland Transport, but this essentially is arguing for parking minimum. So I just really want to understand the thinking around where this has come from, and also when we look ahead in terms of our goals, has the author considered where we're trying to get to in terms of our climate plan and what we have to do through the transport emissions reduction plan? That this is, there's a lot of conjecture in that paragraph, and I'm just very surprised to see it in the report. So I would just like to understand the thinking behind it, because I think we have addressed the fact that it's kind of counter to what the MPS is requiring, but it is making a massive assumption, and it's also arguing for parking minima. So could I just have a response to that, please?
Yes, through the chair. Thank you for those comments. As I said earlier, that I had drafted that in conjunction with AT, and where we'd got to with that was that where the consideration of the number of vehicles per household has been assessed, and that was in another paragraph, I can't quite remember which one that is, that it is still expected that most households will own a vehicle, and that is the current situation as I understand it, where there's 92%. So that was the basis of the inclusion of that sentence. Now, as we've discussed also, that does run a bit counter to where the MPS was going, and in terms of the council's overarching goals around its response to climate change. And so the recommendation has been adjusted to bring it back into line with the MPSUD and reflect the goals of the climate plan.
Thank you, and thank you for acknowledging that and for making the changes to the recommendation. I think that's really important to do, and it's good to hear John Duguid's comment that you will follow up further with legal, because I do think it's an issue that it wasn't raised under the risks and mitigation section of the report, that I would have thought that was a big risk, that, an EV car park is still a car park. Sorry, Mr. Chair, just my last question. Around accessibility. Accessibility is more than just car parking, of course. It's about the accessibility for those who don't drive and can't drive and still want safe access and convenience. So will the investigation be able to take into account all of the different aspects of accessibility into buildings, and also is the resolution now worded in a way that if accessibility or any other of the issues that are being addressed aren't necessarily a unitary plan amendment, that they will actually be, they need to be picked up elsewhere? And could you give an example of where, for example, the Building Act might actually need to be amended rather than the unitary plan?
Through the chair, thank you.
Councillor Aaron.
Yeah, through the chair, thank you for that. So in terms of the recommendations before you today, if you read recommendation C, Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 together, that is where the issues for people who don't own a car but have accessibility issues will be attended to in terms of the design of private pedestrian and bicycle access. So that's how we anticipate attending to that issue. And you're right that in terms of investigating these further, and as John Duguid indicated, not everything that we might discover needs attention is necessarily appropriately managed through the Unitary plan. And we have a number of staff who would then look at where and how the council would attend to those in other policy arenas. And for example, we have been working closely with our disability advisors in terms of their understanding of these issues. So when we report back to the committee on our findings in terms of investigation of Roman numerals 1 to 5, where it's not appropriate to manage the particular issue through the Unitary plan, we will have checked in with the relevant experts to identify where they are appropriately managed or whether council manages them at all. If I could just add that in terms of amending the Building Act, that is something that the council can advocate to government for, and there may be better clarity about what that advocacy could or should be following the outcome of this work.
Thanks, Erin. That's good to hear.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now, look, I did say I was concluding questions at Councillor Fletcher, but now I have Councillor Bartley as well. But Councillor Bartley is the council liaison at the disability panel, so I would like to hear from her. And then concluding with Councillors Sayers and Hills. Councillor Fletcher, your call, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm taking from the responses that I'm listening closely to that this is going to be very much a market-driven approach in terms of developers. So I'm assuming that that's where you're coming from. And I do want to acknowledge the work that Councillor Dalton has undertaken to address some of the issues around quality of life, equity and disparity. And it's really on that I just want to have some better understanding of what's being proposed, because as I see it today, we are not going to get into the minutiae in terms of the evolution and the policy development here, that officers are coming back to us to seek guidance in a more general sense. So in that, I want to better understand E and would hope that Erin can just help me on that. So under E, you're saying note the consequences to communities who drive by necessity, not choice, because of current public transport inequality. So can I understand in a definitional sense what note means? Does it mean that we note the weather's good today, or does it note that, you know, is it a proactive noting? How would officers interpret it? And secondly, communities, is that geographical communities? Is that communities of interest? Could I just have some clarity around how these words will be interpreted by officers as to the governance direction that we're setting today?
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Erin, can you respond to the councillor, please, on the E?
Thank you. Through the chair, as I understand it, a recommendation to note something is not a directive recommendation. It is something that the committee puts on record as having formally understood. And so while this particular recommendation has been prepared by Councillor Dalton and Darby, as I understand it, we would provide some further consideration of this issue and report back to it as part of the wider report backs. in terms of the types of communities. Councillor Fletcher, you're right. It's geographic, but it's also other types of communities, such as those who are in the disabled space or whatever other type of community, how they group. I might also just invite my manager, John Duguid, to assist in answering this.
Just before we get on to that one, can I just come back to the note? If it was the collective intention of the meeting to be more proactive, what word would you use rather than note?
Look, can I come in here, please? And I will defer to John Duguid in the first instance. I'll bring John Duguid in first, please. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this amendment was, or this addition was initially put forward by Councillor Dalton in a slightly different form. It was seeking that council staff, along with AT, do an investigation into this topic here. It is a very broad topic. I guess it's acknowledging that removing the car parking minimums will have different effects in to different communities in different parts of the Auckland region, and in particular, I guess Councillor Dalton's concerns, and I would agree with them, is that you know, in areas that are poorly served by public transport at the moment, and unlikely to get a radical increase in public transport over the next, you know, 10, 20, 30 years or beyond, where developers choose to provide or go ahead with no car parks at all, you know, there will be differing impacts to situations where developers...
disparity, yeah.
Yeah, to high areas of, you know, high public transport, great access to jobs and amenities and so on. So, you know, there will be differing impacts over time, but the investigation into how to deal with that is not really within the scope of what we were suggesting under C, which was primarily about, are there some things we can do to the unitary plan? Are there some potentially non-unitary plan things that we could do in the short term? But really addressing that issue as a much longer term issue and gets into you know, significant additional investment in public transport as one part of the potential solution in those areas. So that's probably about as much as I can add. So, but just to clarify, the note is something that we would feel more comfortable with and be required to investigate this issue and come up with some potential short-term solution, which I don't think there is something that simple.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank you, John.
Perhaps you and Councillor Dalton can answer my concerns on this, because I do fear with Housing New Zealand or Kāingaora that I mean, everybody is hard pressed for funds, and there is going to increasingly be more and more compression in that area. I just don't want to see the disparity that could emerge and the inequities if this is not sensitively dealt with now. And I think we have a responsibility in terms of governance, if it is the collective wish of the majority of us, that we should give greater guidance on this now.
So look, Councillor Dalton, look, I will invite Councillor Dalton to come in on this. This is also a reflection of comments that I've heard from a number of councillors about transport equity and transport inequality. And it is reflected in the Auckland plan, our focus on equity. Auckland Transport are very aware of it. They've been undertaking work recently in the very targeted marketing of some transport services into areas where there is public transport, but there's not uptake of that public transport. So this is work that Auckland Transport is very aware of, and this note is a reminder to us that we have got work to do in this area, and we will do it through various avenues. There's not a single avenue through making a plan change, as the NPSUD requires us to do on removing car parking minimums. This is other areas of our work that we need to undertake. Councillor Dalton, it's not a speaking term, but I would like you to come in right now, if you can and will.
Yeah, thank you,
and
Chair.
just reflect on your E.
Yeah, I guess the part I struggled with the most was that policy 11 is specifically addressing density where people do not necessarily need to own or use a car to access jobs, services or amenities, and that certainly is not all of Auckland. It's a part of Auckland. The work that's being done, there is some other work being done though. Councillor Fletcher and Remu are doing a piece of work around people who who use their car by necessity and not choice, and that will provide some evidence. There is a combined piece of work between the Ministry and CSI with empathy interviews with people who can't access public transport, so we get more of a lived experience understanding of what is happening out there. So I understand what John is saying, and thank him for his time on it as well, that they don't have the fact is there is no resource to do this work, and it's so big, it's too big to bring back. So I don't know if there's a recommendation that can say refer to, but I think noting, which wasn't my recommendation, but I accept noting, is it holds it there, and we just need to continue to note as we figure out a way of how to address this, because it's bigger than just investment in public transport.
I appreciate
your
explanation. I still feel that note is too passive and doesn't necessarily reflect the debate and discussion and questions that I'm hearing.
Thank you. I will now go to Councillor Bartley, liaison councillor for the Disability Panel also.
Thank you, Chair. My question is around C, and thank you, Erin, for coming to the Disability Advisory Panel. You're pretty accurate about the feedback that they gave verbally, and I hope there's the opportunity for them to provide feedback in written form. Definitely a lot of concerns around accessible parking and the importance of cars for this community, not just in terms of personal transportation, but a lot of other things they use the car for. Also, they talked about how what is considered close parking for able-bodied people is not the same for people with disabilities. My question is around ensuring that we are going to, not guarantee, but make sure that the provision of accessible parking is going to happen, as opposed to being some kind of guideline that may come under what you've got here in C under or other means in order to mitigate possible poor development outcomes. So really just trying to nail down some guarantee that we're going to be able to provide for the concerns of the Disability Advisory Panel in regards to accessible parking, and whether using accessible parking actually dilutes their concerns as the disability community around, or any other people with mobility issues.
Erin.
Through the chair, thank you for that, Councillor Bartley. We are clear that we do need to do a bit more technical work to make the provision of accessible parking correctly rendered into the Unitary plan, because as I explained, we rely on a process associated with the Building Act or the Building Code to establish the numbers, and so we're working on that technical work at present, and so the plan change that comes forward will be part of delivering that solution in the Unitary plan. So yes, that's where the work is going, so we expect to report back to the committee on those issues.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
One more, please, Chair.
Yes.
It was around E. I share the same concerns as Councillor Fletcher. If we don't have the capacity now, we could have it later. So why can't we use a term like investigate? And why is it just related to people that drive by necessity, not choice, because of public transport inequality? Because people drive by necessity. It's not because they don't have other options to catch a bus. When I got yelled at in Onehunga about the invading streets, it was tradespeople that needed to use their cars, mums with babies and children. So, yeah, I also have concerns about E. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And going now to Councillor Sayers, and then finally Councillor Hills.
Oh, thank you, Mr.
Councillor
Chair.
Sayers.
Thank you. The more I listen to this, Chris, the more concerns I have. But my questions would be probably one to John Duguid's unit, maybe one to Auckland Transport. So my understanding is that Auckland is almost like a one-size-fits-all, Chris. I'm a little bit I'm not comfortable with the government doing a mandate, right? So does the Auckland Unitary Plan, it's already removed the city's height and intensity rules, allowing, you know, a huge amount of additional higher density housing and more people to live in and around urban centres, and particularly around those public transport routes, Mr. Chair. So my question is just, is that statement correct? Are we in line with the policy that the government's trying to mandate to us? And then a follow-up question.
Thanks. Is that that question best fetched by John Duguid or Erin? I will take the first voice I hear.
Thanks, Councillor Darby. John here. I'm happy to take that one. So, Councillor Sayers, that's the really links into the previous reports to the Planning Committee in August and July around changing the Unitary Plan to allow more height and intensity. First of all, in the walkable catchments of the city centre, metro centres and the RTN stops, and then the second report, the more recent one in August, was about potential further intensification in other areas that are well served by transport, but not necessarily on the rapid transit route, and in areas of high land value. So at this point in time, you know, we would it would be stretched to say that the Unitary Plan has given effect to the NPSUD. That really hasn't. So there will have to be some zoning changes to enable more intensity and height in some parts of Auckland. As a committee, you've given us staff some pretty clear direction to start preparing some concepts, some maps indicating where those areas might be, and we will be bringing that back to committee and local boards towards the end of the year, and certainly in the very first quarter of next year, with a view to, as agreed by the committee, engaging with Aucklanders in March, April next year. But no, there's still more work required to give to the effect of the NPSUD intensification requirements that must be publicly notified by next August, and that is going to see some additional height and density proposed in some parts of the region.
Oh, thank you, John. I also want to compliment you and Erin, particularly Megan, Auckland Transport, all the other staff that have been involved in this report. So just picking up on that, John, so it does go out to the public actually get a chance to have their say on this. Did you say August?
Yeah, through the chair. So in terms of car parking, the removal of the minimum car parking requirements that are currently in the AUP, Auckland Unitary Plan, that happens automatically, and it must happen by next February. That's what the NPS Urban Development requires us to do. We have to remove them, and there is no ability for members of the public to make submissions. But these consequential technical changes referred to in recommendation B, and then the broader investigation of things like accessible parking, cycle micromobility, EV chargers and so on, pickups and drop-offs. That, if we were to put some changes into the Unitary Plan, they would go through a submission process. We're not required to make those changes. They're just things that we are recommending that we investigate. But if a plan change comes out of them, then that would go through submissions and a hearing, and no time frame around that. So February, the minimums must be removed, no submissions. The consequential changes and potentially some of these investigations, they would with submissions. We can't give you a time frame for that at this stage. And then in terms of the height and density, that is a plan change that's required by next August, and that would go through public submissions and a hearing process from next August.
Okay, John, thank you for that. And Chris, my other ones probably might be Auckland Transport more orientated, and that's around the ability in the future. So as new subdivisions are getting built, the streets are quite narrow, and could Auckland Transport in the future potentially remove those parking in those future streets, or restrict them by metering them?
Hamish, that's probably one for you. Can you?
Oh, it's Claire Kovacic here.
Claire,
through the chair, I'd be happy to answer that one. So yes, we do have the ability to do that. Once a road within a subdivision is vested, we have the ability to regulate it. So going forward, it may be that regulation comes into play, and certainly where there are any issues for width of road for access, and this has come up numerous times, access for safety, access for emergency services, we would look to do that to limit parking.
Well, thank you very much. Look, Chris, I'm not against the intention of the central government to increase development in the urban areas, particularly those housing with, without off-street parking that's very close to rail stations and also major transport hubs. And those property owners will be driven by the market. They might not need a car. They might be able to get to work without one, and they will buy or rent accordingly. However, I do have issue supporting this recommendation. It seems like a decree forcing Auckland to have zero provisions for off-street parking across the entire super city.
Councillor, can I just come in there? Can I just keep those for the? We're just in questions now. Would you like to keep those?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Look, I don't want to make a comment. That is my questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much. And finally, Councillor Hills, please.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair. And I did ask some of these questions in the workshop, but haven't got the information. But could you just make it very clear that this is not forcing anyone to not have car parks and anyone to not have cars? This is not forcing anyone to stop building car parks if they choose.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct, Councillor Hills.
Cool. And I also asked for the figures on developments in areas that have no minimums now that are still building car parks. Is it true that over 85% of current apartment builds which are being built where they don't have to provide car parks are still providing car parks for almost every dwelling, even though they don't have to? I think the number's about 85% of builds currently underway.
Through the chair.
Aaron, do you have those numbers?
No, I don't, but and my apology for not picking up on that through the planning committee workshop, but we can work with our consenting team and urban design unit to identify those numbers for you.
But you would say, from what you know, that almost, well, a very high majority of builds are currently providing car parks even though they don't have to. And like, because the last figures that I can find were earlier this year, which said it was 85%.
Yeah, through the chair, I couldn't authoritatively say that that's my understanding because I haven't looked at those figures.
Okay, cool. And in the past, when and I'm talking about Co-House, which was a couple of years ago, and other developments where the owners have wanted to have no car parking, so the people buying into it were wanting to have none, there was a stage where we were forcing them to have car parks, even though the developer and the owners did not want them, which would have cost each dwelling over $75,000 more. Is that the kind of thing we're trying to avoid with this policy? Is that forcing people to spend almost $100,000 more per property, even if they don't want to?
Through the chair, that's correct as I understand it.
Okay, so thank you. I guess this is all these questions. My questions in the workshop that I don't feel like have been answered are what the benefits are and why what we're trying to achieve with this, and what all parties in Parliament, government and opposition, are pushing by supporting this. Is that the fact? Is that what we're trying to do here, or what the government is trying to make us do? Is to not force people to do something they don't want to do?
Through the chair, that's what I understand the intention of this policy and the national policy statement to be.
Thank you. And the last question, that maybe is for Auckland Transport. I definitely support C2, design of private pedestrian bicycle access where no vehicle access is proposed. But does that put us in any issue that we're requiring private developers to provide good access and good pedestrian and cycle access, but we aren't actually doing that by virtue across our town centres, neighbourhoods, streets ourselves? Would this force us to ensure we are doing that for pedestrians and cyclists too, not just requiring private developers?
Through the chair, if I could perhaps answer that in the first instance, the council is required to comply with its own unitary plan, and so where the council is developing facilities and sites, it would be expected to deliver on the accessibility requirements in the plan. So yeah.
Thank you. Would that also relate to footpaths and cycle lanes on street and neighbourhoods?
That's an asset that is managed by Auckland Transport, and I might invite them in to discuss that matter.
Hamish or Claire?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, but I'm not clear on what the question is. I'm sorry, Councillor Hills. Please could you repeat it as it would apply to the road corridor?
Yeah, apologies. I guess and potentially it's a leading question. I guess my kind of concern, or maybe a positive outcome that could come from this, is if we are requiring developers to provide good private pedestrian and bicycle and micromobility access to their access ways. Would that also force us to ensure we have those for public areas, such as roads and streets that don't have footpaths, don't have cycleways, have things that are blocking, don't have ramps for people in older person scooters and things to be able to access parks and streets and town centres, which currently is the case in many areas?
Yes, so I think that I like the intent of that, but I think that we would need to be careful with the precedent, because the unitary plan, obviously, and the way that we manage our road corridors are governed by different legislation as well as different mechanisms. So, I mean, by that, we would start to be looking at other things such as car parking, and I think we could get into, unequivocal comparisons there. So I don't disagree with you. I mean, there's an intent to provide well for alternative and active modes of transport. I'm not sure that would directly link the two unitary plan requirements.
It was worth a shot.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's leave it there. Members, that's the conclusion of the questions. Thank you for your inquiry. It's on the back of our workshop and yesterday's memo that went out responding to oral questions from that workshop and written questions, and we've had almost 2 hours of questions today as well. So we are concluding the questions now. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we will be back at 25 past midday to conclude this item. So stay with this link and come back in 5 minutes, please. members, Kalinda, would you just give me a cue to confirm that most people are back on, please? Can you
Yes,
check?
I can see that most members are connected and online.
Okay, so members, we will now go to the debate. I think we've had a lot of debate on this, in some ways through our workshops and through the questions here today. So it is moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Dalton, but I just would like to just check on one item. In the break that we've just had, we've just had some consideration of maybe a change to the E. Now, Kalinda, do you have a change there to, I think it was the E, through Megan and possibly through Councillor Dalton?
I think that Duncan was going to show that change shortly.
Okay, I need to...
Through the chair, Chris, maybe, yes, sorry, Councillor Dalton, I've just tried to call you, but I have emailed you some amended words, but Duncan's getting that shortly. So it's in your hands, Chair, if you want to pop now, or whether I just wait to hear from...
I got it. I emailed you.
Okay, this is, if we could just bear with our electronic meeting process here, members, because I would like to just give the opportunity for Councillor Dalton to look at something and confirm it or otherwise, and have that change made so it's clear to us all. Councillor Dalton, you've seen a suggestion from
Yeah, look,
the Chief of Strategy.
yes, I have. Yes, I heard something from Megan. I've responded. I'm comfortable with the additions.
Thank you. Let's put that up if we can, please, Kalinda.
Through the chair, I'm happy to talk that through if that would be helpful.
Yes, please. Megan, please go ahead, and we'll see the words very shortly.
Yes, the words should be up on your screen now. What I was trying to capture from the comments, particularly Councillor Fletcher, was this is a much bigger policy issue that, as you say, can't be just dealt with now in this piece of work, but it's a thread. It's more than a thread. It's a direction really that you've set through all council's policy work. And so what I've tried to recognise is we can keep the specific comments or the consequences to this particular piece of work, but I've just added, but recognising that this equity of service and choice across communities is something that we're actively trying to achieve through all our policy work, including parking, transport, land use, climate, water and housing. So it's not exclusive, but it's trying to include these big areas that we're looking at equity around. So I'm wondering, I'm hoping that has perhaps framed that conversation a bit into a resolution. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, we've got that up. So what we're moving and seconding is the motions that are on the screen now, noting the change at the E. So just briefly, because I think we have had a lot of discussion on this, just a reminder, members, that we're actually required. This is an edict. A national policy statement doesn't provide too many options, and in this case, there is no option. The territorial authorities are required to remove their requirements, if they currently have them, for car parking minimums. Now, we did a lot of that through the Auckland Unitary Plan process in 15-16, and there's some areas where they remain. So they shall be removed. But there is no suggestion that council is prohibiting the provision by developers or anybody that might be developing property from providing car parking, none whatsoever. Now, if the market that drives developers, their commercial and design decisions, informs them that car parking is or is not required, they can respond accordingly. So that's available to them. If they decide to utilise the land for more valuable purposes than car parks or driveways associated with car parking, they can. And that utilisation might lead to the provision of better amenity within the dwelling unit they're designing and developing and outside it. It might be better balconies. It might be better dimensions inside, qualities overall, landscape, trees, better design overall, and ultimately that might lead to more houses on a site, which would lead to hopefully more Aucklanders finding a home to be their home. So I'm very aware that building costs these days are probably started around $3,000 a metre, if you can, and range for apartment developments probably through to 10 and 15,000 and 18 and possibly $20,000 a metre for some high value apartments. A 10 metre square car park can add 40 to a conservative $100,000 to the price of a dwelling. We're just not requiring that anymore. It can be provided, we're just not requiring it. So these car parking minimums will be removed. We're required to remove them. And then there's a range of investigations that we're going to undertake in coming months to look at a number of provisions that we could possibly amend through a plan change. Again, we're not putting developers in a head hold here to not provide car parking. And I think that's the point that I do want to emphasise. So thanks, members, and I want to acknowledge again Councillor Dalton for the contribution. So now I will take the other speaking turns, and I will first go to Councillor Linda Cooper.
Gosh, I didn't think I'd come up so quickly. Thank you, Councillor Darby. I mean, you've said a lot of the things that I think you've encapsulated a lot of what the recommendations reflect. At first, when this came through, I was absolutely appalled to think that this could really disadvantage a lot of our communities, particularly under the Unitary plan. You know, we've enabled a huge amount of intensification in the outer suburbs that correspondingly don't have good public transport, and that has been a huge issue with our local communities out west, in our town centres. And so for me, these recommendations go some way to doing something to the bits that we can possibly do something about, and we don't quite know yet because we've got to have that investigated. That's the purpose of this report, to go away and investigate. And so hopefully we can do some things. I mean, I'm really concerned that there's no consultation proposed because of the edict from the UDS, but good that we can do some public consultation on some parts of plan changes that will be required. Of course, I understand, and I listen to my younger colleagues around the table, and there's a real drive from them to get change, and I understand that, and I think that's important. If we're not going to change things for the better, or to respond to the way the world is changing, then and to growth, then we may as well not be here. But at the same time, I'm still mindful that there are a lot of people that are really worried about change, that it will directly affect them. And so this work that's going to be investigated by our staff is really welcome by me, so I will support them, because not supporting them is actually futile. It actually does address a lot of the issues that councillors have brought up, listening to all the questions and the questions that were answered previously that were sent out. You know, some things we won't have much control over, but let's work on the things that we can. So thank you for all the work that's been done by Councillor Dalton and yourself and our staff to get to where we've got with these recommendations, and I look forward to seeing the results of the investigations. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. I will now take Councillor Shane Henderson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's great to follow Councillor Cooper because I agree completely with all of that. Just three really quick points. First and foremost, I want to back up your point, Chair, around that we are required to do this by the NPS. So I don't think now is the time to really debate the merits or not of the proposal. It just doesn't seem like a particularly good use of time. And at any rate, I'm very glad that we've changed the troublesome wording on the previous recommendation, because quite apart from anything else, I also wouldn't have voted to condemn council to costly litigation anyway. The second thing I think we should look at is just in terms of E. I actually preferred the previous wording, but I'm happy to go ahead with the new one as well, because we need to look at places that definitely have public transport inequality. That's a real thing all across our city, but also places that are geographically isolated, and I'm aware those things kind of go hand in hand. And there'll be plenty of us that represent islands or peninsulas within our wards where this type of housing that we're talking about in this debate has gone up already. And Te Atu Peninsula is a good example in my ward where the ship has already sailed. And I think we need to be scrambling to increase public transport to meet the huge amounts of townhouses that are going in on a peninsula where there's one road in and out. And my concern related to that is that at the moment I don't think we have the ability to increase public transport services to meet the new demand quickly and flexibly. It just doesn't seem to be the way that we operate, and I think we do need to look at that really closely. The other thing, just briefly, is that where we're talking about developments with no car parking in a lot of residential suburban areas, in the coming months, you've correctly pointed out, Chair, we'll be talking about this, but I want us to also look at the surrounding streets and as part of a network which could take on a lot more on-street car parking. And what does that look like from a safety perspective for people? And we should work with our local boards and look at things like yellow lines. Can they be put in quickly and efficiently? That kind of stuff. Because safety is a big issue in my ward in a lot of these developments, and I'm sure it'll be for a lot of others as well. So there's a couple of quick points, but I'm glad that we seem to have improved these recommendations very well. So thank you, Chair, and thanks, staff.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. I'll now take the call from Councillor Kuhn, please.
Oh, ngā mihi, Chair. I would like to make a number of points in talking in support of these revised recommendations that are greatly improved. Just acknowledge, staff, there is a tightrope that they're walking and the work that they're doing on the MPSUD and different parts to navigate around the government's growth agenda. But when it comes to removal of the parking minima, the direction is very clear. It's not optional. We have to get rid of parking minima, and in doing so, this is an opportunity to address some of the anomalies and issues that we're seeing around the Unitary plan anyway. And so I do welcome further investigation, particularly addressing these issues around poor design, around access to properties, accessibility needs. I mean, that all needs to be addressed in any case, and so we've got to progress that work. And I think we've kind of lost sight in this conversation so far around the huge benefits of removing the parking minima. It does provide for greater housing choice, it does bring down the cost of housing, and it does provide more efficient land use. So there's a lot of assumptions around what the future's going to be, but what we do know is that with a decarbonised transport future and what we've got to be working towards in terms of the climate plan, that we just can't make assumptions that every household is going to, that we have to prescribe parking needs as if we're going to reflect the current situation. So I do think there's some thinking that's needed to really look towards the outcomes that we're trying to achieve rather than the presumptions that are coming through in some of the transport thinking in this report. Because it was kind of progressing along the lines of an EV car park is kind of like a backdoor way of getting around the NPSUD. An EV car park, a car share car park, that's still a car park. And the big fix for our, in terms of the climate emergency, isn't just going to be replacing the current car parking needs with EV car parking, because we still have to address all of the issues around congestion and making our transport network more equitable, and that's a big part of also reducing, the requirements around requiring car parking are actually one of the things that increases inequality in the transport system that we have at the moment. So I totally acknowledge the issues that councillors have raised around current developments where there's a lot of congestion in residential streets for parking needs. And we're seeing developments being built where there isn't clear marketing due diligence around what their storage needs. If they have any storage needs around whether it's an EV car, an ICE car, a boat, or their clothes, they've got to do due diligence and ensure that they buy what they need in terms of their housing, and also can take advantage of not having to purchase parking, and they can decouple it. And the example of the car park in the city centre that went for, I think, about $250,000 isn't an example of the need for car parking minima. It actually showed how the market around valet car parking is working. That just showed that in that building there was a demand for valet parking. There's actually plenty of parking in the city centre that's a way lot cheaper than spending that amount of money. So that wasn't actually, that didn't come up because of a deficiency of parking, which takes me to just the second part of policy 11, which is around parking management. And we haven't really discussed this, that policy 11 also is asking us, strongly encouraging us as a council to manage effects associated with supply and demand, not through parking minima, which was the tool of days gone by, but through parking management. And we can see that parking management is really effective where it's applied and working, and we're seeing that in the city centre with, say, residential parking zones, or through pricing. And that is where we've got to make more progress, and where that's lagging behind. And that is going to be one of the fixes that's going to help new subdivisions that don't have enough on-street parking. And that's where we have to put far more work. And we would need to see Auckland Transport put the resources into parking management. So thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to have worked on these resolutions with you as well, particularly around ensuring that the recommendations actually reflect the NPSUD, because I think we were going down a bit of a risky approach there by trying to do a backdoor way of adding in parking requirements. So I do support these changes and the investigation that will be underway, and looking at a broad range of solutions, not just changes to the unitary plan. And thank you also for the addition of E. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you. And now taking the call of Councillor Newman.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, look, I listened carefully to what my colleague Pippa Coombs said, and I found myself disagreeing with most of it, but we're still friends. I just, for me, the difficulty that I have with this is that I'm being invited to endorse the development of a plan change in B, and I know that we can't stop this because it is a national policy statement set down by government. I just don't support B, and so the best I can offer, really, because it would be irresponsible of me to vote against it, and I hate the idea of doing this, but if in relation to B, if my vote can be recorded as an abstention, if there was the ability to vote this down because the choice was there, not because it was a national policy statement directive from central government, I most definitely would be voting against B. I'm happy to support all other recommendations, Chair, and I do agree with E. For me, Chair, this is another example where the local government sector is being directed by central government to make plan changes that I think have a lot to do with ideology and so-called cheap housing. But I think that's quite irresponsible. In my view, removing car parking minimums will have a perverse effect. It will be a boon for developers who want to have a short-term race to the bottom by trying to pack in some more housing, and then they will privatise their profits and walk away. And the consequences of that development, yeah, you will have some more housing, but you'll also have clogged streets. And those clogged streets will be particularly obvious where you have communities for which there is actually poor provision of public transport. The report says 92% of Auckland households have a car. And my bet, Chair, is that the vast majority of those people who have a car do so by necessity. And so I think that this national policy statement flies in the face of the needs of Aucklanders, particularly those who don't live in the city centre. And whilst the $288,000 single car park auctioned recently in the CBD might be at the top end of town, Chair, it does foreshadow what is going to happen, because Bill Cashmore is right. Developers who want to stay in the industry and meet the demands of the market, they will provide for the off-street parking. And what will happen is that this requirement will increase the value of the off-street parking, and that will affect price. So there will be a change in price, and it will make developments less affordable. Finally, Chair, I do note that whilst this is a directive of central government, they haven't attached a check to this. There's no additional funding for the RLTP. There's no new funding for contracted bus services in the regional public transport plan. There is a reference to the non-statutory parking management rules that Auckland Transport is supposed to administer. It's akin to the government simply responding to the problem that the government is directing us to exacerbate by handing us a pamphlet and handing us a directive to do certain things to deliver policy outcomes and planning outcomes that exacerbate problems in communities for which vehicle ownership and private vehicle use is a necessity is not responsible, but it's once again a product of government directing us what to do, but not paying the consequences for it. So, Chair, I appreciate the conundrum that we all face here, and for those of us who don't support this, but who find ourselves directed to endorse the plan change, I apologise to those colleagues who don't support B in principle, but are going to have to vote for it. But if my vote and abstention can be recorded, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Newman, and it will be, and Kalinda will have taken notice. Thank you for your comments there. And I will now call for comments of the seconder for these motions, Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for accepting my proposed amendment into your substantive recommendations, and also thanks to Erin and Andrew for their time yesterday and John Duguid this morning. I just want to go back to policy 11 of the MPS here, which is, this is what I really struggled with, the bit that says it's specifically addressing density, where people do not necessarily need to own or use a car to access jobs, services or amenities. And as I said earlier, that doesn't reflect many of the outer suburbs. suburban Auckland, the suburbs without accessibility to public transport. Yet as it's a national policy statement and we're a unitary council, this will apply to all of Auckland, and it just doesn't seem right or fair or equitable. The transition time is also tight, you know, implementation February 2022, next February, end of February. It's reasonably quick. And the value of the land is entirely in the hands of the developer. I'm not convinced that we're going to see cheaper housing through this policy. The recommendation, you know, I just spoke about it before. I did ask for it to be consider because of the recommendations that are there and the paper itself. There was nothing in there about the equity for Auckland. It wasn't addressed, and although the amendment's been changed now to say this is an outcome of all of our policies and the work we do, it wasn't in anything in the paper or in the recommendations. I felt it needed a place. We need to keep it top of mind, and if it's a noting, then it's a noting. It's got to be there. We've got to be conscious of considering to how we're going to consider to address the inequity. And so if we're going to achieve the desired outcomes of the housing density policies, and we've got a few coming at us, you know, we had an Auckland plan. The very first Auckland plan was we must build and intensify around the rail corridor or the frequent traveller network. And we got distracted by special housing areas, and then we've got the Unitary plan, which allowed us to build a house on the piece of land the size of a postage stamp and out in the suburbs, nowhere near frequent traveller network. So, you know, we got a bit stuck, and now we've got thousands and thousands of people living away from any access to public transport. And for the people that are going to be coming into these communities that continue to intensify, the potential of having no car parks. So if we're going to try and achieve the outcomes of the frequent traveller network, the Auckland plan, and if we're not to perpetuate the current inequity of public transport, if we're going to reach our emission reduction targets, and if we're going to leave no one behind, then we must consider the consequences of this MPS that is now coming into our unitary plan and our other policies, because the people that are driving are the same people that Councillor Bartley was referring to as well. It's not just the ones that can't get into the transport, it's the people that have lots of kids, that have lots of family commitments, that have disability. There's hundreds of thousands of people that cannot use public transport for a lot of reasons, and so they need a car. And whether that car remains a petrol car, a diesel car, or moves to an EV, they still need a car. And what we are experiencing in the suburbs is a lot of cars on the roads already. And so I worry about the comments that Hamish made about traffic management. You know, this is how we're going to do it, through traffic management, and what that's going to mean. We're going to perpetuate the poverty and the restrictions of people that have to have a car. So my recommendation is simply to keep a presence of in our minds and our work for the people who travel from the south and the west and the east to Highbrook, to Middlemore, to the Wiri industrial area, and who are nowhere close to being able to get to public transport. They are driving by necessity, not by choice. I really also struggled with the analogy that Councillor Coombe just made with regard to wardrobe and choice. And I've heard Councillor Coombe say it before, and I understand it, but it doesn't relate to anything in my world or the people that I represent. That you choose what you're going to purchase. If you need a wardrobe, then you purchase a house with a wardrobe. If there's no car parks, then you can't purchase a house with a car park, so don't have a car. It doesn't work that way in reality. So the recommendation is really for the people that I just spoke about before, for the caregivers of children with a disability, the workers, and all the people that are going to continue to be pushed out into the suburbs to purchase their homes or to rent, that will need a car, that can't access public transport. This policy does not work for them, and it perpetuates an existing situation that we found ourselves in by not sticking entirely to bringing the people to the public transport network, because we can never afford actually to take the public transport network back out to the people. We can try and fill that gap, but it's very, very expensive. So this is more than investment into public transport. It's also investment, it's our policies around urban design and how we build our communities, which is what the original Auckland plan was about: live, work, play in the same place. So thank you, Chair, for accepting E, and I will be voting for all of the recommendations, even though it, goes against the grain. It is what it is, and I'll be supporting them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. I will now take the speaking turn of Councillor Walker, please.
So I'll be voting against this, and the reason for that is it's completely half-baked. I'll make a few points around that. First of all, it's relying on the marketplace. If we accept that the marketplace, particularly in the environment we have going forward, is incredibly price sensitive, there'll be an incentive for developers to not include parking, even against a background where there is demand. That will be most acutely felt in parts of Auckland where there are issues with house purchases and for lower socio-economic parts of our community. So effectively, this is a massively inequitable policy. The other concern that I've got is that as it stands, I don't believe that it's going to deliver on the council's carbon plans. It makes inadequate provision for car sharing as compared to other cities. I asked the question around microcars. As far as I know, both the Unitary Plan and the National Policy Statement on Urban Development do not define a car. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that is the case. And effectively, we will end up with communities probably driven by parts of council like Kainga Ora, where there is inadequate parking provided. Other developers will be forced to follow suit. So we'll end up with parts of our street network that are cluttered with cars because people have nowhere else to park. So I just think that this whole project here is incredibly underinformed on the part of government and strongly ideological. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. I'll now call upon Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll be quick because I find myself in the same invidious position that some of the previous speakers have of realising the reality that this is a policy directive from government, but at the same time being fundamentally opposed to both the provisions and the kind of ideological zeal that drives it, in my view, that isn't really based on neither practicalities or sound research, or increasingly in terms of the climate change objectives as they apply to the use of potential use in the future of electric cars actually run contrary to the incentives and to the assumption that there's going to be at some point a very significant crossover to that type of climate-friendly vehicle, which these sorts of provisions for those people that are going to be living in dwellings that they have no parking provisions will effectively be cut out of. And I would just use the example of Japan in this respect, which has excellent public transport systems, as we all know. But what's perhaps not sufficiently realised is that in significant parts of Japan, people still own cars. They don't use their cars during the working week to to commute, because that makes no sense time-wise or expense-wise. But they still retain ownership of a car for weekends and for other types of activities that perhaps aren't so well served by the use of public transport. And as a country, we're far more affected by that type of ancillary use than just commuting to work. If you think of sports, if you think of shopping, if you think of big families, you think of anything where the practicalities of public transport, just purely from a cost perspective, just don't add up. So I thought Councillor Newman examination was an excellent one, so I won't repeat the points he's made. I would just say, though, that when I think of this policy directive, the parallel that's drawn into mind that occurs to me is the huge work and effort that this council put in back in the 2013-16 council with a similar type of directive on special housing areas, which had entirely perverse effects, which actually increased the price of land and therefore the cost of housing in a number of instances, and where the much trumpeted affordability provisions dwindled away to very little, if not anything, in a number of cases. And I suggest that in this instance, any flow-on cost benefits again are being hyped up. That's not what's happened with SHAs. It's not what's happened with typologies, particularly terraced housing typologies, which were meant to be a big part of the kind of unitary plan push for more affordable housing. And I suspect this will be a similar development where the cost, in fact, will be transferred, potentially a bigger cost, to having provision of parking somewhere else, which again happens in some overseas countries. So without prolonging things anymore, like others, you're forced in a position where you realise the constraints put in our officers and are grateful to them for trying to make whatever minor amendments they can, but still being forced with a proposition that really doesn't make sense, that I fear will have perverse outcomes, and which I don't really feel like supporting as a consequence. Otherwise, the message back to the government is that, well, no, by absence, that there is no opposition here, this does make sense, where in actual fact a number of people in this council have got a number of very valid concerns that aren't being addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. And now Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in acknowledging the hard work of all of the officers in putting forward this paper today, I mean no disrespect, but I'm feeling really angry over this, because when I asked, with COVID, we have had several meetings and we have talked about the response that we might have. And the one thing that I asked for was, would the Mayor, who seems to be the sole person liaising with the government right now, would he kindly go back to the government and explain, with the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, with the RMA reform, with the water reform and every other bit of reform, could we have a bit of a breather so that we could actually respond more meaningfully and prioritise those things that we need to be doing for our communities with COVID right now? I was assured that, oh, no, we don't need any more time. We've got all the information we need. We've got all the staff we need. We've got everything we need. But and it's just been said by Councillor Watson, that I remember that same imperative, that we had to keep jumping and just ask how high we should be jumping on SHAs and everything else, and being one of the only ones, I think, or one of the few anyway, that voted against those and voted against Ihumato and voted. And what I've learned over the years that I've been a politician is act in haste and repent in leisure. I know that most of what is being proposed here is admirable. It's for the right reasons. For those of us who have long wanted further intensification along the corridors and to ensure that, you know, we could actually really add to the life of the city. I feel a bit betrayed because I'm now put into the position of arguing for things that actually should be being handled in a slightly more strategic sense. I think we're a lousy negotiator with central government. We should have gone back to them and been far, far firmer. And because of that, I will vote against this today, but I don't want to. I actually want to support, and particularly the good work that has been undertaken by Councillor Dalton. But it's just so terribly frustrating that we've got all these well-intentioned people all looking at things but not comprehending the unintended consequences that will happen, I believe, if we don't really own it right now and push back when we do need to push back. I think I've talked about the concerns that I've got over equity and disparity out in the south, but what I haven't talked about at length, and I don't really like to think about it anymore, but prior to my husband's death, I spent 4 years nursing him from the diagnosis that he had. And over those 4 years, progressively, I had to have more and more help in the home. And I promised those people, particularly towards the end when it got really hard, the person, usually a woman, who had to come in and help me with showering in the morning, to the person who came in and took the blood test, to the person who helped me with the continence issues and all of these other practical things that you actually have to do. And all of them reminded me that they could not do those jobs unless they had a car. And the disability issues cannot be underestimated. And the assumptions that we make have always got to look at best case and worst case scenarios. So I don't want to labour that, but as a grandmother with 6 grandchildren, as somebody who has nursed somebody in a wheelchair over a long period of time, I just don't think we've really got a good handle on a lot of this stuff. And as a consequence, I can't support today, even though I can see, in terms of aspiration, what people are trying to do. And it's admirable, but it's going to be nothing but good intentions unless we can look at the practical delivery on things. And I think we've got too little information on this now, and I think we should be pushing back to central government and buying ourselves some time. So I'm voting against it today.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. I think the final comment is now from Councillor Hills. Councillor Hills, and then I think we will go to the vote.
Kia ora, Chair, and it was just brief, and we aren't supposed to be debating in the chat, and I see some people are. I just wanted to say that this is, yes, it is a directive from government. Yes, they were trying to make housing more affordable in 1,000 different ways. This is supported by all parties in Parliament, so we don't have a choice. That doesn't mean we can't push back, but we will end up in a lengthy legal battle, and we've already been in a legal battle through the Unitary plan over car parking minimums as it is. The last stats I could find was, even in the areas where we have no parking minimums, 85% of developments are having parking built within them, even though they don't have to. This actually removes us forcing people to put a certain number of car parks in. I've spoken to business owners who have said they would have built, a larger restaurant or a bigger retail, but they were forced to add more car parking spaces in town centres where they didn't think it was appropriate or the cost wasn't needed. The co-house development a couple of years ago almost didn't get through, and it was a collective of many people putting their money together to build a development together, and they didn't want to have car parks. They were choosing not to have car parks, but our planning rules was forcing them to spend over 75,000 more per dwelling to have car parks that were going to be unused. When we talk about Japan, they have dropping car ownership, and actually in their cities, in the places where they used to have car parking minimums, 40 to 50% of their car parking garages lay empty, and in the 2 decades ago, some of the parking provisions, 3 to 4 stories of underground parking, actually were the biggest contributors to price increases to building those apartments. This doesn't force anyone not to have a car. This does not force anyone to not build car parking, and we're seeing the market and developers are still pushing to have car parking because that's what people want and that's what people need. What this does do is provide choice for those who may not want to add the cost of parking to a building. There are plenty of buildings being built now in my ward and through the city that are having choice. So you can buy an apartment for 50,000 in Northcote right now. If you add a car park, that's 80,000 more that you choose to add on to your thing if you'd like to have a car. This is not forcing anyone to do anything, but we are being forced into this, and I'm glad that we've had this conversation today. It's definitely not easy, but I don't think there are many answers to the housing crisis right now. But whether or not you like this policy, we are being pushed into it by all parties in Parliament, and we have to react and we have to try and make the best of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hills. We're going to conclude it there. Just one thing, I'm really not going to take a right of reply, but other than to say, members, we were first alerted to the MPS UD and the requirement to remove car parking minimums almost a year ago. Oh, actually, it's over a year ago. I think it came out in August. So there's been no haste in arriving at this. A lot of work has been done by our staff and us politically. In fact, I was probably more ambitious. I thought we should be seeing this report in April and said so at the time. It was going to come at our last meeting, but some councillors wanted a bit more work to be undertaken. There were questions to be asked and answered, and we did that work. So by no means have we rushed to this. We're about a year since we found out about this directive. And I'd also like to suggest that there's no question of this being an ideological response. One could argue that there's an ideology about providing car parks and mandating that. I don't think there's a system of ideals in either camp. We're responding intelligently to the national policy direction of government. So we will now go to the vote, and I have had a call for a division, but I do not know on which part. I'd like to just point out that the A is a note of the direction that the government has given us. Can we take that one on the voices, please? It is a noting.
The divisions on this entire lot, Chris, is A to F. It's pretty clear.
Sorry, I've got a lot of feedback. Councillor Sayers, I'm going to just silence my microphone as you say that again, please, so we don't get feedback.
Sorry, Chris, is that clearer?
Yes,
A to F.
yes.
A to F division, please. The whole lot, the resolution.
Okay, we'll take the A to F. There's a call for a division by Councillor Sayers on A to F, and I will now pass to the Governance Advisor, Kalinda, to take the vote.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a division on the whole motion.
Sorry, we have poor sound there. We can start the vote again, please, Kalinda.
Yes. The division on the whole motion, Councillor Darby.
4. So we've got poor quality sound
Mr. Chair,
again.
can somebody else take the division, please? I can't hear properly.
Kalinda, I'll take it if that's all right.
Okay, passing the division to Duncan Glasgow, please.
She was having some technical difficulties, so I will just take this for her. Councillor Bartley?
What?
Councillor Casey?
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore?
4.
Councillor Collins?
4.
Councillor Coombe?
Aye.
Councillor Cooper?
4.
Councillor Dalton?
4.
Councillor Philippina?
5.
Councillor Fletcher?
Against.
Mayor Goff?
For.
Member Henare.
Abstain.
Councillor Henderson.
For.
Councillor Hills.
For, thank you.
Councillor Mulholland.
For.
Councillor Newman.
I'm for on all of them except with respect to B, for which I apologise, I'm an abstention on B.
Noted, thank you. Councillor Sayers.
Against.
Councillor Simpson.
For, except for B, which I'm an abstentions. Thank you.
Noted, thank you. Councillor Stewart.
Against.
Councillor Walker.
Against.
Councillor Watson.
No.
Member Wilson.
Abstain.
Councillor Young.
For.
That is carry 16 votes to 5.
Thank you, Duncan. So that concludes that item, members. I will now conclude the balance of our open agenda before we break for lunch and then come back for the confidential agenda. So now going to item 9, and I will move accordingly, and Councillor Bartley will second. And that's noting the forward work program. Members, just to advise, you've received an update on Queen Street that was emailed to members on the 30th of August. It's being tabled at this meeting and it will be attached to the public minutes of this open part of the meeting, that particular memo. That's item 9. Can I call for the vote in favour on A and B? All those in favour say aye.
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 To the contrary, no. And declare that carry. Thank you. There is no consideration of extraordinary business under 10. We've heard from our Mayor earlier on. And it takes us to the procedural motion to exclude the public. And the reasons for confidentiality is we're dealing with sites of significance to mana whenua, the tranche 2 plan change investigation. This does identify particular sites of cultural significance which are sensitive to Māori. So, and also that's the C1 item, and C2 is the Auckland Light Rail update, and that includes our response to the Auckland Light Rail Establishment Unit. So I will...
May I speak to this, Chris?
It's not moved yet. I will move...
When it's moved.
I will move the procedural motion. Councillor Bartley will second, and I have a call to speak to the motion for this. Now, a procedural motion. Kalinda, is a procedural motion spoken to? Kalinda, are you with us? Or Duncan, if you are with us, if Kalinda has lost her connection, a procedural motion, Duncan, is it spoken to? Now, I don't have any advisors.
Yes, it is possible to speak to this motion, Mr. Chair.
Sorry.
Within standing orders.
Sorry, I know you'd like to be an advisor, Councillor Walker, but I do rely, in fact, we all rely on our governance advisors to give us advice. Kalinda or Duncan, are you on the line, please?
Yes, Chair, apologies. You can speak to this motion.
Okay, I wanted that clarification. Councillor Walker, speaking to the procedural motion to exclude the public.
So I'm speaking to C2, which is the Auckland Light Rail update. I've read the reasons for passing to go into confidential and also the grounds. And on my perusal, I can find no grounds to substantiate that. This particular item, I would suggest, is in the public interest. I know of no need to protect the privacy of natural persons. There is no trade secret involved. I do not think it prejudices the position of the person who supplied the information. And I do not believe that it prejudices the free and frank discussion that might follow. So if it is felt that there is a particular reason to go into confidential, can we look at some substantiation for that? Because as it stands, on my perusal of the item, it should not be in confidential. In fact, there's every reason for it to be in the public.
Okay, thank you. I'll just quickly go to Megan Tyler, Chief of Strategy. Megan, there's a challenge to going into public excluded, particularly on C2. Would you just offer us a brief outline why we should?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, just to be really clear, the purpose of the report to the committee today is to enable you to provide direction to the establishment unit on their advice and recommendations through to the sponsors and ultimately the cabinet in a month or so's time. The purpose or the reason that we have made this confidential is that we do believe that you do need to do it in confidence in order to provide free and frank advice and direction, but also to have some clear and confidential information provided to you about where the establishment unit might be getting to, the implications for that long term for Auckland, but also even in areas of finance, of land use development, and the best way to do that, and the only way to do that in our view, is that it is in confidence. Now, ultimately, we are clear that this will be released into the public, certainly once Cabinet has made that decision. Remember, Cabinet is a confidential process as well, and so we felt that it was the best way to do this was to ensure that your process was confidential as well, so that that doesn't prejudice any discussions that Cabinet might have, or obviously the sponsors prior to that. I understand Councillor Walker's concerns in general terms, but it is very clear to me that it is absolutely appropriate that this be in confidence, even though we may wish it to be in open. It is the right thing to do in this circumstance for this project. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Through you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. A further comment?
Sure.
Councillor Walker?
I would just like to speak against that. I think the perusal of any of the councillors around the table would reveal that there isn't anything in this particular item that should be in confidential. As far as the issues around land use and the like, those matters are out in the public anyway. I think the reverse is the case, that there is every reason for us to be open and transparent about this. It's one of the largest projects for the Auckland region, aside from the CRL. It has huge potential disruption of an order of magnitude that Auckland has probably not seen, arguably more disruption than the CRL, which has been catastrophic enough. So I think that we should be going into public for this.
Thank you, Councillor, for those comments. And members, I'll take the vote on this. Just
I put in the sidebar that I wish to comment.
Okay, Councillor Fletcher, please. Take your comment.
I'd like to ask Megan if she could advise whether there were parts of this paper that could have been put on the open agenda.
Megan, could you reply, please, to Councillor Fletcher?
Yeah, thank you. I think yes, I'm sure there are, and I haven't gone through it to determine all of that, but there is certainly some of this that is in the public arena, as you say, and we know that the engagement has begun through the establishment unit. So we know of things like the broad routes, or certainly the two key roads of Sandringham and Dominion. So there are things like that that are already out in the public. You're absolutely right. Notwithstanding that, however, the ability for you to discuss that and to get information at a level that is not in the public at the moment, but will ultimately be, is the reason really for confidence at this stage. I hope that answers your question. Happy to take more, Councillor Fletcher, if you've got some follow-up on that.
Well, I do, but I'm mindful that people want to break for lunch. But in speaking to it very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I think that it's unacceptable that where we are out in the public domain, we are seen as a co-sponsor on this, and we are seen as a partner on this project, which has enormous fiscal implications for the ratepayers of Auckland, that we are not at least having a discussion in the open agenda on those matters that can be carefully discussed. Obviously, there needs to be some rigour around that information that we need to give guidance on. But I think suddenly to just go and hide the whole thing, it doesn't speak well of the type of democracy that we want to see in Auckland. It doesn't fit in with our own protocols around openness and transparency wherever is possible. And I would urge you to take the lunch break and see what matters could be discussed in the open agenda, rather than forcing those of us who might be supportive of this project being forced again to vote against it. I think it's just been sloppy, that the whole thing has been bundled up into one report, rather than allowing there to be open discussion around where we are to the present point in time, and then the guidance at a governance level that we can give for moving forward. But I remind you again that right now, out in the public domain, we are seen as the co-sponsors of this, and I think that we have to carry some responsibility for our behaviour and the amount of information that can be disclosed or not disclosed. So could Megan be a little clearer at what specific points within the material we've received that she does require confidentiality on?
Megan, are you able to respond?
It's probably not the level Councillor Fletcher needs, but if you wanted me to work on this at a lunch break, you know, that could be my response. But in broad terms, it is the fact that, notwithstanding that there are some of these elements in the public arena, you're absolutely right, the opportunity for you to both get information, a level of information and direction or suggestion of where the establishment unit is going that is not in the public arena is the main reason why this needs to be confidential. So while, for example, in public, we could talk about the two, let's just say the two main routes of Sandringham or Dominion and take a view or a conversation about which might be better than others. There is a level of information even within having that conversation, which is not in the public arena yet, which will be ultimately, but isn't yet. And so it would be very hard to have that conversation with any robustness or rigour without going into that or understanding that level of detail. So that's really the key reason why it's confidential. One could pick out all sorts of things that is in the public, but in order to have a real conversation, I think that would be quite difficult for you.
Mr. Chair, I move the motion be put.
Okay, we've got a motion before us that requires us to go straight to the vote. Procedural motion by Councillor Cooper. So I note there's some requests for comments there, but I need to go to that motion. It's got a second. I think the second was Councillor Filipona. I will go.
Yep, and that was my comment. I was going to get that moved as well. So thank you, Linda.
I will go straight to the vote, please. Kalinda or Duncan, possibly.
So this is on the procedural motion to close the debate.
By division, please.
By division, all right. Okay, so Councillor Darby.
4.
Councillor Bartley.
4.
Councillor Casey.
Yes.
Councillor Cashmore.
4.
Councillor Collins.
4.
Councillor Coombe.
Aye.
Councillor Cooper,
For.
Councillor Dalton,
For. Sorry, for.
Councillor Filipina,
Aye.
Councillor Fletcher,
Against.
Mayor Phil,
For.
Member Henare,
Aye.
Councillor Henderson,
For.
Councillor Hills,
For.
Councillor Mulholland,
For.
Councillor Newman,
For.
Councillor Sayers,
Against.
Councillor Simpson,
Against.
Councillor Stewart,
Against.
Councillor Walker,
Against.
Councillor Watson,
Against.
Member Wilson,
Aye.
Member Young.
No.
Duncan, can you please read the total?
It's carried 16 votes to 7.
Thank you, members. Now, that was the procedural motion.
No, nothing they abstained. There's no abstained there, Mr. Chair. Was there any abstained?
Thank you. I'll just go back to Kalinda and Duncan just to check. Were there any abstentions there, please?
I did not hear an abstention, Chair, but if someone would, if a member wants to correct their vote, they can do so now before it's declared.
Okay, it's being declared then at 16 to 7. We will now go to the vote on the procedural motion to exclude the public for the reasons outlined for C1, C2. If we could take the vote, all those in favour say aye.
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 Against.
To the contrary, no.
Against.
No.
No.
Declare that carried.
On C2.
Record for Councillor Watson, please.
Walker 2,
Members,
against C2.
Members, if you could please, look, we'll just go through that right now. Just individually, would you please call your vote against this, please, to Kalinda? Councillor Watson, I think I heard. Councillor Walker, Councillor Stewart. Did I miss somebody?
Fletcher.
Sayers.
Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Sayers.
It's just on the light rail one. It's not on the first one for me.
It is on the procedural motion to exclude the public. That's the motion before us. Okay, got those recorded?
Yes.
Right, I just want to advise members, that's the conclusion of our open agenda for today. Please come back at, let's say 10 past 2.